Top of the morning to you, lads. As the allure of the bright, shining metal draws you in, maybe you followed a rainbow to the end point of it, or you just happened to discover a black pot overfilling with glamorous golden coins, bringing you back to fond childhood memories of Lucky Charms and those happy little marshmallow bits. Today is your lucky day. The luck of the Irish, in fact. It's on your side, and you just struck it rich, and nothing can bring you down. St. Patrick's Day arrives, and you got your pint in hand. You wear your green to avoid any and all pinching from strangers. Your blessings outnumber the shamrocks that grow, and may trouble avoid you wherever you go, whether it's in a house in the countryside, or a trip to Las Vegas. Or maybe you even want to go into the hood, and why not space as well? Wherever you plan to travel, good luck will follow you. Unless, of course, the magical little leprechaun whose gold you've stolen happens to find you and decides to brutally dismember and murder all of your friends and family, utilizing the most obscene and horrid objects like a pogo stick to enact its onslaught of macabre horror in pursuit of its stolen wealth. Ripping out eyeballs, biting others to turn them to leprechauns, operating manic sex robots, and even unleashing a lightsaber. The foul-mouthed, charismatic, fun-loving, miniature menace is now determined to bring you ultimate death and destruction. That's right, we're here to talk about the Leprechaun. Join me as we venture deep into the heart of Irish folklore and explore the entire Leprechaun film franchise. From Warwick Davis to Jennifer Aniston to Ice-T to whatever the hell that this was supposed to be, we're about to analyze the shit out of this oddball film series, break it down, desperately try and fail to understand the lore and timelines, and have ourselves a jolly old St. Patrick's Day marathon. With 8 films in total, ever since the early 90s, The Leprechaun has filled our hearts with joy in the most bizarre and outlandish kind of way. It's the kind of movie series that makes you appreciate the finer things in life, like polishing shoes or exploding your way out of somebody's balls. But as silly as this entire concept may be, the Leprechaun has managed to achieve an iconic status in the world of horror. Sure, he might not be on the same level as Michael Myers or Freddy Krueger, but the fact that 8 movies exist and that people still know of and talk about this character is a testament to his impact. Like Chucky did for dolls, the Leprechaun takes the once wholesome image of a small magical being and twists and manipulates it into a creature of darkness. And I think it's about time this franchise got some love and attention in the form of a multiple hour-long YouTube video, and so here we are. So put something green on, pour yourself a bowl of Lucky Charms, pick up a Shamrock Shake if their machines aren't broken, and whether or not you're in the hood, go ahead and smoke it up too.
A friend with weed is a friend indeed.
Because it's time to talk about the motherfucking leprechaun. But let's start with just what is a leprechaun? Well, they do come from Irish folklore, and there's plenty of variations depending on the regions, but they're usually depicted as small, humanish looking beings, pretty much always depicted as men, and usually with a red beard and red hair, wearing a green coat, shiny belt buckles, and are up to whimsical and mischievous activities, sometimes even granting wishes to those that encounter them. They're usually also depicted as shoe cobblers, and of course they have a high affinity for gold and collecting treasure. There's various spellings for the word, but the origins go back to the Greek and Latin words for small body. And though leprechauns are mostly depicted as good-natured, it's their affinity for tricks and jokes that arise caution when encountering them. They're basically like magical little pranksters, but it's all good and fun to them. They're the class clown of mythological beings. When it comes to them granting wishes, they're not like a genie or something like that. More so, you have to trade something for it. They always want something in return to adding to their hoards of wealth. And if you're unable to trade, you have to serve the leprechaun leprechaun in some kind of mischievous activity or just become his drinking buddy. But it was considered lucky if you were able to catch a leprechaun, since then he would grant you a wish or 3 wishes, depending on the lore, in exchange for his release. But oftentimes, the leprechaun would trick the humans to being able to escape without needing to perform the wish. In other words, in order to have your wish granted or to retrieve some of his gold, you would have to be a very wise and proactive thinker in order to outsmart the leprechaun's tricks. Over time, the leprechaun stories did start to become a little bit darker. Their playful and prankster ways were enhanced to the point where they were stealing babies and replacing them with fantasy creatures, and some believe that leprechauns became a little bit of a prejudiced representation of Irish people in general, depicting them as drunken fools who just wanted to get rich quick. But interestingly enough, as associated with St. Patrick's Day as they are, leprechauns don't really have anything to do with the origin of the holiday, and yet people use the holiday as an excuse to drink heavily and party down, which is exactly what a leprechaun would do. People even dress up as leprechauns as a symbol for St. Patrick's Day. So, like with many holidays, they tend to evolve and change with traditions over time, and now the image of a leprechaun has pretty much become synonymous with that of a lucky day in March. But regardless, this is also what helped propel the creature into pop culture with its various imagery. Once you hear the word leprechaun, you already have a pretty distinct idea as to what that looks like. Or you just think of the mascot character, Lucky, for the Lucky Charms cereal. Hey, believe it or not, Lucky is an extremely important character in terms of pop culture leprechauns, and also directly correlates into the creation of the horror movie. In 1963, Lucky was created as a promotional mascot to sell the completely unhealthy and sugary cereal to children in an attempt to appeal to their sensibilities for cartoon characters and love of marshmallows, thus creating lifelong consumers to a gut-destroying product falsely promoted as part of a nutritious breakfast. Yeah, that's the real horror movie right there. But I can't lie, Lucky Charms are pretty tasty, so fuck it. Let's all get cavities together. In most commercials for Lucky Charms, the cereal would be in place of a pot of gold, and the children would be coming after Lucky in order to obtain it. Ultimately, in the span of numerous 30-second ads, Lucky would fail to stop the kids and ultimately give in to them having the cereal, spouting things like,
"I love me Lucky Charms, they're magically delicious."
And for my fellow 90s kids, who doesn't remember this song?
Hearts, stars, and horseshoes, clovers and blue moons, pots of golden rainbows, and me red balloons.
Sometimes it still gets stuck in my head. But why am I talking so much about Lucky Charms? Well, apparently the writer-director of the first Leprechaun horror film, Mark Jones, was specifically inspired by the idea of this whimsical leprechaun mascot for Lucky Charms, but also wanted to turn it into a villain. So yeah, without Lucky, we would not have our lovable leprechaun. Now, by the early 90s, all of the big slashers in horror were firmly established, and many of them already had a slew of sequels in their wake. But Leprechaun would fill a very specific void for a very specific type of horror audience, and in an odd way, it dropped at the perfect time. Mark Jones was working as a writer on a variety of different television shows, but was trying to get a movie off the ground and be able to direct it himself. It was a combination between the current horror trends and films like Critters, which characters were trapped in a small house fighting off small monsters. And if you watch both movies back to back, you can definitely see the parallels. Look, if you want a Critters retrospective, I'm gonna need a lot more super chats, man. But despite some sources saying that the original script for Leprechaun was much darker and a straight horror movie, in the behind-the-scenes making-of documentary, Jones specifically says that he was trying to make something that would be like a live-action Scooby-Doo.
I want to kind of do a live-action Scooby-Doo, and that was always my intent, because I used to write Scooby-Doos, and I said, I kind of want to make a fun kind of horror Scooby-Doo live-action movie.
He wanted it to be something wacky and over-the-top to go in line with the mythology of leprechauns and their mischievous nature, but just tweak it into being a little bit darker. It was the studio Trimark that bought the script and pushed for them to lean even further into the horror aspect of it, adding more gore to the movie and making the kills more explicit in order to get an R rating. Whereas the original idea was to lean into into a little bit more of the comedy aspect, make it kind of Scooby-Doo-ish in nature, but the studio wanted it to be more 50-50 horror/comedy, and the end result was pretty much that. It's a silly, cartoonish movie with plenty of explicit kills and gore. Trimark at the time had specialized a lot more in television and direct-to-video releases, but Leprechaun was pushed to be theatrical. While only having a budget of just under $1 million, the studio being strict on Jones as a first-time director, and with reshoots to make it more violent and more horror-centric, it would seem like there was a lot going against the film as it was being created. But somehow there was also a lightning-in-a-bottle sort of event that ultimately made this movie really work. Sure, there is the novelty of the concept, a killer leprechaun, but novelty alone can't win an audience's heart. What you need is a real character. So of course, we have to talk about the man himself, Warwick Davis, without whom the leprechaun as we know him would never have endured the test of time. Like Freddy Krueger before him, the character was not going to be behind a mask, but instead under a lot of makeup and needed to be able to perform, act, and most importantly, speak with the other actors. This leprechaun was going to throw out one-liners, talk in rhymes, and interact with people face to face. Charming, hilarious, and evil, Warwick Davis understood the assignment and appreciated the role, never disregarding it as some kind of horror schlock. Instead, he truly embraced the character, which causes him to radiate off the screen. He is the reason this works. This pure, unfiltered joy that comes out within his menacing ways that helps solidify the tone and the experience of watching these movies. Warwick Davis was born in 1970 and with a bone growth disorder that resulted in dwarfism. But never letting this stop him in his pursuit of success, he was exactly what casting directors were looking for when they needed the Ewok characters for Return of the Jedi. And Warwick landed the part of the most famous Ewok of them all, Wicket, the one that finds Princess Leia and introduces her and the audience to the village of Ewoks. And this made me have a thought that if Return of the Jedi was being made today, they probably just would have done all the Ewoks with CGI, which is really sad. Thankfully, since it came out in 1983, they opted to use real actors, and people like Warwick Davis got to have a job and jumpstart his career. He even continued to play Wicket in all those direct-to-video Star Wars Ewok movies. Yeah, anybody remember these things? I remember renting them from the video store when I was a kid, hoping for more Star Wars movies, and yeah, I got Battle for Endor. They are something. They are Ewok movies.
It's a breathtaking adventure that soars to extremes of heroism and treachery.
Afterwards, Warwick would land the lead role of Willow in the Ron Howard-directed fantasy film. It's a fun little movie that I admit I've only seen one time, but I do remember him being great in it. And also, apparently, they did a revival TV series in 2022 where he reprised his role, but I guess Disney Plus took it off the platform, so now nobody can watch it. Another great aspect of streaming services. Yay. I have no idea if there's any physical copies of it, but I'm sorry for anybody that liked the show after they took it off. But when Warwick Davis got the script to The Leprechaun, he immediately jumped on board, excited for the prospect of getting to play an evil character after being a good guy for so long. And man, did he nail it.
Is that me gold?
What the hell are you?
I'm a leprechaun, me dear.
The prosthetics and makeup look great, especially for the time period and the budget that they had, and all of his specific mannerisms and gleeful dark reactions come through it all. A wonderful combination of a great actor with great practical effects and tons of cheesy dialogue for him to say. Gabe Bartalos did the makeup effects, and they took the general idea of what a leprechaun would look like when it comes to his outfit, but they did away with the red beard in favor for a more grotesque ribbed skin design look, and probably made it easier for Warwick to act in it without the beard addition. Now, the way these retrospectives work is I talk about each movie in release order, but when it comes to the lore and origin of the leprechaun character, well, he doesn't really have one. He's not Freddy, who was a child murderer that was burned alive. He's not Jason that drowned in the lake. He's not Charles Lee Ray, whose soul is now in the body of a doll. He's just a leprechaun. And in fact, each leprechaun movie, though it's not specifically mentioned, may actually be featuring an entirely different Leprechaun in each film, as references and continuity to previous films are incredibly rare, as well as the powers and abilities of the Leprechaun being a bit inconsistent. But as we try to figure out all of this, and before we dive headfirst into the original film, I'll try to explain this the best I can with some visual aid at the timeline board.
Welcome everybody to the Leprechaun Retrospective. I promise I'm not going to talk in that voice the whole video. What is going on, guys? We are here to break down the Leprechaun franchise as my St. Patrick's Day gift to you. And over the years, we've made a lot of jokes about me being short, small, ginger, Irish, whatever the case may be. So I am here to finally fulfill all of your desires and be the leprechaun you need. Maybe not the leprechaun you want, but the leprechaun that you need. To be honest, I wasn't even sure if my hat was fitting in the frame, but in a way that makes it funnier if it just seems to go on forever. I'm also using a brand new camera and a brand new microphone, so I really don't know what this is gonna sound like just yet. If you've seen the other retrospective videos, I usually have my microphone up next to my mouth so that you can hear me nice and clear. But today we're just gonna hopefully cross our fingers and rely on the acoustics of the room. So welcome everybody to the Leprechaun Retrospective. If you've never watched one of my retrospectives before, essentially I go on a tangent of madness trying to understand and fit all of these films together in some kind of coherent continuity. But of course, with the Leprechaun series, we pretty much have none of that. And you could try really, really hard to make these movies make sense in some kind of order. And by the end of it, you're just gonna wanna pour yourself a pint and give in to the madness. But regardless, I am still here for you guys today, so let's talk Leprechaun. Okay, so leprechauns are, of course, mythological beings from Ireland that love their gold, like to polish shoes, and tend to partake in a little bit of a beverage every now and again. And so I think we should all embrace that today. So everybody gear up with whatever kind of leprechaun antics that you have inside of you and let loose the pure fury of mischief that leprechauns are known for as we get into this. So we're gonna go over kind of the basics here about what we're about to cover in all of these reviews. I also have everything time-stamped down below. This won't work if you're watching it live when it premieres, but any other time, just go ahead and skip these segments if you don't care for them and go right to the reviews. But essentially, we're gonna break down the Leprechaun franchise like this, and we're gonna talk about each movie individually going in release order. Now, obviously that means we're gonna start with Leprechaun from 1993, but what I like to do also in these videos is try to explain some kind of continuity between all of these films and how they fit in together. The thing with the Leprechaun is, none of this makes any goddamn sense. None of it at all. All right, this is, okay, we've covered Halloween, okay? And Halloween, although it might seem wild that a slasher franchise with just a guy in a white mask stabbing people has multiple different timelines, the timelines themselves are not too hard to follow as long as you know which one to go to. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre retrospective, we learned that there's even more branches of timelines when it comes to that series, which make no goddamn sense, along with prequels and then legacy sequels that reboot from the original, and it's just a goddamn mess altogether. Then when we covered the Child's Play franchise, that was glorious, because other than the remake, there's only one timeline in the Child's Play franchise. It's wonderful. And then we get to Leprechaun. And Leprechaun has no timeline. Leprechaun has no continuity. Leprechaun is just insanity from start to finish, and it makes no sense, and I'm gonna explain to you why. See, not to jump ahead with spoilers, but yes, Leprechaun does get defeated at the end of the original Leprechaun that we'll go into. And most horror series tend to try to come up with an explanation as to why the killer comes back in the next movie. You know, whether it's a dog in a dream world pissing on Freddy Krueger's grave that makes him resurrect, or Jason gets trapped at the bottom of the lake and then in the next movie, you know, he's unleashed by a girl with psychic powers. Whatever the case may be, the Leprechaun movies have none of that. However, the Leprechaun is defeated at the end of one movie, he just is somewhere else at the beginning of the next one, and they don't mention anything about it. But beyond that, everything else changes too. The nature of his powers change. The rules as to what can defeat him change. And of course, any kind of lore and backstory as to where he came from is also subject to change. Which means you can think of the Leprechaun franchise in one of two ways. The first way is that every single movie in the original run of Leprechaun takes place in its own universe. It takes place in its own continuity, and it doesn't connect to any of the others because it doesn't even try to. The age of the Leprechaun is different, his powers are different, how he's defeated, what can kill him, all of these things are different in every single movie. So the first way you can just look at it is that every Leprechaun movie, other than Leprechaun Returns, and I'll explain this in a minute, is just within its own tangent universe, within its own continuity, okay? So that would mean that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different timelines in the Leprechaun franchise. Or you could go with theory number 2, which is, I think, the more fun theory, and I also think the more popular theory, is that every movie deals with a different Leprechaun, and they all just happen to look and sound exactly like Warwick Davis. So you could look at Leprechaun 2 as just featuring a very different Leprechaun that looks and acts the same, and we could just imagine that every Leprechaun is exactly the same, right? Which is kind of more fun to think about, that there might be hundreds or thousands of Warwick Davises out there causing mischief with people. So I tend to like that theory, but neither is confirmed or denied because none of the creators of these movies ever really thought that deeply about it, but I did, okay? So let's go into this real quick. This is what we're gonna cover today. We're gonna start with Leprechaun, the original. And then of course we're gonna move on to Leprechaun 2, which again, either takes place in an entirely different continuity or is just about a different Leprechaun. Then we're gonna go to Leprechaun 3, and then we're gonna go to my personal favorite and the best movie ever made, Leprechaun 4 in Space. And then this one, okay, this one can seem confusing, right? So the next one is Leprechaun in the Hood. And then the one after that is Leprechaun Back to the Hood. Now, based on those titles, one would think that Back to the Hood, especially because they put the number 2 as opposed to the word 2, like Too Fast, Too Furious, that's a sequel to In the Hood. And you would think that, right? In the Hood, Back to the Hood. No, you're completely wrong. Both those stories have nothing to do with each other. They're about completely different leprechauns, and I don't even think they take place in the same hood. So those are also in different continuities or with different leprechauns. All right, then after that, we get into the reboot territory with Leprechaun Origins, which is the farthest removed from any of these movies and also takes place in its own universe with its own leprechaun. That's very different than the other ones. And then after that, we get Leprechaun Returns, which is the only movie in the whole franchise that directly connects and references a previous movie. Leprechaun Returns is a direct sequel to the original Leprechaun, okay? So that's how you can think of it. Leprechaun really only has one true sequel with Leprechaun Returns, and then all of the others, even though they're numbered and even though they all star Warwick Davis, they're essentially their own films that stand on their own, create their own rules, create their own weaknesses, and never bother to touch on, reference, bring up anything that happens prior. So now that with that out of the way, and a very brief, basic understanding of the Leprechaun. Right now, we're gonna start from the very beginning. We're gonna review the very first Leprechaun, so let me prepare with a classic Irish breakfast, and we'll get right into this shit. You know, I need something else. A true Irish breakfast.
The original film wastes no time getting to the point, as the very first thing that you see is the Leprechaun, the title character, right there in the first frame, coming down the stairs in a cavernous area and counting up his gold.
Who steals me gold won't live through the night.
So within a few seconds, you already get what you paid your money for. The Leprechaun. And like I said earlier, the Leprechaun of this movie doesn't really have an origin story of any kind, it just plays on the general mythology of leprechauns. So we don't really get to introduce our character so much as we see him counting his gold, and that's the most prominent thing about him in this movie. He just loves his gold, so don't take it. And guess what happens? The first character that we meet, named Daniel O'Grady, shows back up at his home in North Dakota, surprising his wife with some newly found wealth, claiming that he caught a leprechaun while in Ireland and stole his gold. He's pretty ecstatic about it, but he didn't count on the fact that the leprechaun stowed away in some of his luggage and is here to get his precious gold back, beginning by tormenting O'Grady's wife and causing her to fall down the basement stairs, killing her. When O'Grady eventually returns home, the leprechaun taunts him by using his wife's voice.
Did you hide it somewhere near the house?
And all of the creature's powers and abilities in this film, they're not specifically explained one by one. I think we just go with the general idea that he's using magic, and we keep it at that. But to be a little bit more specific, he does use some powers multiple times and seems to favor these ones, such as teleportation, which makes sense with the idea that it would be hard to catch a leprechaun, and he also moves things around, I would say probably using telekinesis, as just a way to kind of explain what he's doing, moving things with the point of a finger. He also has the standard horror villain strength and durability. I wouldn't say that he's super strong or anything, but definitely resilient enough to be able to tank multiple shotgun blasts and tear people's limbs open just by scratching. He also seems to be able to heal and regenerate very quickly, even being able to put pieces of his body that has been chopped off back on. So yeah, regeneration and healing abilities are at an all-time high. He only seems to have two specific weaknesses that are mentioned in the movie. One is that because of his trade as a shoemaker, he has this compulsion to polish shoes whenever he sees them, making for a good distraction. If you have a bunch of shoes in your house and he finds them, he's gonna polish every single one of those bitches one by one. My man will literally postpone killing you until the shoes are in a serviceable condition. And hey, if you have a large collection of shoes, you might just want to put them in front of the leprechaun, not just to distract him from killing you, but also because your shoes are probably going to look pretty good when he's done with them. And of course, the major weakness that he has is that he is vulnerable to four-leaf clovers, to the point where it's said that the four-leaf clover is the only thing that can kill a leprechaun. O'Grady is able to trap him in a crate by putting the clover on top of it, preventing the leprechaun from escaping. So it looks like the four-leaf clover also serves as some sort of magical barrier against the leprechaun as well. Overall, it's a pretty powerful creature capable of doing a lot of magical abilities that cause harm, but also if you just happen to have some shoes or a four-leaf clover lying around, you can keep him at bay and even kill him pretty easily. Also, it's stated in this movie that when he has possession of his gold, that's what increases his magical powers, so that's another reason why he's so desperate to get it back. But regardless, after trapping the creature, O'Grady suffers a stroke that I guess is also a result of some of the leprechaun's powers. He does mention that he's cursing him, either that or maybe the leprechaun just carries a death note around with him. I'm not really sure, but it's not until later that we find O'Grady actually survived this moment. But unfortunately, with the four-leaf clover still on the crate, the leprechaun is trapped, and we cut to 10 years later, bringing us to the present time of the movie's release in 1993. A father and his teenage daughter, Tori, played by Jennifer Aniston, which I'll get to her in a minute, but they're moving into the old O'Grady house for the summer, fixing it up and planning on having a wonderful summer season together. It's a typical setup with the father that's excited about being away from the city, and Tori serving as the typical high-maintenance teenage girl that cringes at the thought of having to live in a broken-down shack like this, away from all of the conveniences of her pampered lifestyle. Until, of course, she runs into one of the three guys that is fixing up the house named Nathan, and suddenly she is just horny enough to maybe want to stick around for a while. Rounding out our cast of characters, we have Nathan's kid brother Alex and their friend Ozzy, who, throughout the entire movie, they make jokes about him being dumb.
They make fun of me?
Not in front of you.
Only behind your back.
And I'm not sure if he's meant to have any specific mental disabilities that would make this feel way more mean-spirited than just at first glance, or if they're just poking fun at the low intelligence of people in rural areas, which is also a pretty negative stereotype. It's never specifically mentioned. All they say is that he's pretty dim-witted, but mostly he just seems to have kind of a childlike whimsy and he believes in magic and things like that. But every time that I see this movie, I can't help but remember this actor from Pee-wee's Big Adventure, which is also a movie where he plays a childlike adult.
You're an idiot.
I know you are, but what am I?
I know you are, but what am I? I know you are, but what am I?
But okay, let's talk about Jennifer Aniston. So she obviously is the most famous actress that's in any of this franchise, and this was her first starring role in a feature film. She's most famous for playing one of the lead characters on the TV sitcom Friends that premiered just 1 year after the release of Leprechaun. She's a household name now, and mostly because of that TV show. And she's become so famous that all future releases of Leprechaun on physical media changed the original poster design to put her smack dab on the cover to help sell the movie. She's been in a bunch of big movies outside of Friends as well, We're the Millers or Horrible Bosses, and plenty more, but she remains most notable for the show Friends. And even though I'm not a fan of that show, because I would rather spend my time watching movies about killer leprechauns,
No one told you life was gonna be this way.
regardless, even 20 years after the show's finale, she still remains a household named actress. And as far as her role in this movie, I mean, she's fine. I don't think anything about her would stand out if not for her fame afterwards, but she's completely serviceable here along with the rest of the cast. They're all fine. My main curiosity just comes how in real life, Jennifer Aniston seems to be very ashamed and embarrassed of this movie, and my question is, why? Okay, sure, I get it. It's her first role. She's not as confident in her acting abilities, and it's a movie about a killer leprechaun, but so what? She doesn't have to do anything super embarrassing in the movie, really. There's no nudity or anything too gratuitous or questionable. She's a pretty average teenage character in the film. And it's a major part of horror history. Lots of great actors got their start in horror, like Johnny Depp, whose first role was in Nightmare on Elm Street, and then he even came back to do a cameo in Freddy's Dead many years later. I guess it's just probably always awkward to look at your early work. Hell, there's plenty of early YouTube videos that I made that I cringe at, but also, there's kind of the respect of the process of building yourself up. You always have to start small. I heard rumors for many years that she outright refused to talk about this movie, or that maybe it was in her contract to not bring it up in any interviews, though I can't find any validity to that statement. It's just hard to find any comment about her talking about it. There's a moment from the Howard Stern show back in 2019 where she talks about being embarrassed to watch it with her boyfriend at the time, and also that when getting casted, she was excited to work with Warwick Davis, knowing him from the movie Willow.
Is that when you did the movie? This movie is the bane of your existence. You decided to do the movie Leprechaun, and you hate that.
And it was with Warwick Davis, the guy from Willow, was in it.
That's a big deal.
Big deal.
Yeah.
I watched it like 8 years ago with our mutual friend Justin Thoreau. Tried to like get that thing out of the remote out of his hand, and there was just no having
You mean he happened upon it?
He was like, no.
I guess my point is, I wish that she wouldn't feel so ashamed or bad about being in this movie, because at the end of the day, acting is a job, and she was fresh starting out, and she took a job. I also think that if she embraced it a little bit more, like imagine if she showed up at a horror convention somewhere or something, I bet horror fans would go nuts and everybody would be bringing their Leprechaun DVDs for her to sign. I think she'd be very valued and appreciated in the horror community if she just leaned into it a little bit more. I kind of think about the other end of the spectrum when you have somebody like Jamie Lee Curtis, who, even though she admits not liking horror movies in the least, she shows respect to the Halloween franchise, getting her started, and is willing to return to the franchise on multiple occasions despite not loving the genre itself. Sure, I bet that they paid her a remarkable amount of money to do it too, but hey, if Jennifer Aniston ever wanted to return to Leprechaun, I think people would lose their minds. And she's done enough now in the last 30 years to solidify herself as a mainstream multi-million-dollar earning actress, so why not just say, fuck it, and just do a small Leprechaun revival? Well, any chance for that was probably lost because she didn't show up for this sequel, but we'll get to that later. Ultimately, all I'm saying is I wish she wouldn't feel ashamed, because Leprechaun is awesome, and she's just fine in it. Anyway, back to the first film. It is not long before Ozzy is drawn to the basement and accidentally moves the clover to unleash the Leprechaun. One of his character traits is that he's very superstitious and believes in magical entities, so naturally, nobody believes him when he tries to explain that he just saw a leprechaun downstairs. Other than that, there's a rainbow outside which leads Ozzy and Alex to a broken down truck where a bag of gold magically appears. I don't quite understand this part though, because the gold was supposedly taken by O'Grady in the beginning, which would have been 10 years ago. So why does it appear in the truck like magic at the end of a rainbow? Because it makes it seem like it's something the leprechaun did specifically, or maybe when the leprechaun was released, that's when the rainbow appeared and the gold just magically respawns at the end of the rainbow whenever that happens. I don't really know, but to see if the gold was real, Ozzy decides to bite into a coin, but accidentally swallows it. How this happens, your guess is as good as mine, but it's a major plot point that there's a piece of gold in his stomach. Meanwhile, the leprechaun starts to do some questionable stroking of Tori's feet, but hey, he's not pulling a Tarantino or anything here. Remember, he's obsessed with shoes, not obsessed with feet. It's very different. They think a cat might have scratched her, so her father checks out the sounds that are coming by a nearby tree, and then he gets bitten on the hand. And luckily, this is not Leprechaun Part 3, or else he might be turning into a leprechaun himself. But here he goes to the hospital and is effectively taken out of the entire rest of the movie. I wonder why they didn't just kill his character off, since he literally never shows back up. It might have been a good way to get in an extra body count and also raise the stakes to take away one of the main characters, since none of the main cast ends up dying by the end of the film. But nope, he just gets bitten, and then I guess his fate is undecided. Also, real quick, here's the leprechaun on a tricycle. The real main first kill of the movie is the shopkeeper in town that is inspecting the gold that Ozzy and Alex found. The leprechaun shows up to get his gold back and also murders the shopkeeper with a pogo stick. Yeah, as creative as Jason and some of the other slashers get, none of them could pull off something like this other than the leprechaun. I respect it. He then drives a little car on his way back to the farmhouse, only to get pulled over by a cop using the best excuse possible.
Say, aren't we a little young to be out this late?
No, I'm 600 years old.
There's an extended sequence of the leprechaun stalking and killing this police officer in the woods, and I have to imagine it was probably part of the reshoots in order to make the film more violent, but hey, it works for me. It's a good little horror sequence. The leprechaun gets back to the house and goes looking for gold, of course eating some generic Lucky Charms in the process, since they probably couldn't afford the IP to get the actual Lucky Charms brand in the movie. And I just can't help but think, as I make this video, how much I have seriously been craving Lucky Charms. It's kind of crazy. When the crew gets back to the house, it's not long before they have their first interaction with the leprechaun.
Oh, it looks like you're hurt. Let's play surgeon.
Nathan gets caught in a bear trap, and I just love how the leprechaun just starts swinging like crazy at him with an axe and biting his leg. He's such a vicious little fucker. I love it. He also tanks several shotgun blasts, which shows in this situation, size definitely doesn't matter. One of my favorite bits is when he drives his tiny car into the truck that they're attempting to escape in and just turns the whole thing over. So not only is he super strong just merely in the fact that he exists, but also when he drives the tiny car, the vehicle is super powerful as well. The characters make their way back indoors, chopping off one of the leprechaun's hands in the process, but that's just a minor setback for him. And remember, this is still him not as powerful as he would be if he had all of his gold, so I wonder what he would truly be like at full strength. There's a scene where Ozzy and Alex admit that the gold he's looking for is stashed in the well outside, so Tori arms up and goes out to get it. Seeing Jennifer Aniston walking around with a shotgun is a very bizarre image to see based on all the other characters she's played in her career, but maybe there's an alternate timeline out there where the show Friends never existed and Jennifer Aniston only did Leprechaun movies. I would love to see her character become this badass leprechaun hunter over time. The leprechaun shows up and takes his bag of gold, but soon discovers he's missing that last piece of gold that is currently in Ozzy's stomach. So there's some more attack sequences, and we also see how bad of a shot Nathan is with a gun. After distracting him with some shoes, Tori makes an escape to go talk to the one man that might know how to defeat the Leprechaun. O'Grady, which was the guy from the beginning of the film that apparently survived his stroke but has been living in a nursing facility. But of course, the Leprechaun gets there before she does and now starts chasing her around in a wheelchair. Damn, we've seen him on a tricycle, in a tiny car, on rollerblades, and in a wheelchair. He definitely knows how to get around. I always thought this next part felt super convenient as Tori goes into the elevator and O'Grady's body just happens to be in there, but I guess the Leprechaun throws the body down the elevator shaft off screen and that's why he crashes through. For some reason, I never got that when I was younger. Anyways, he tells her to look for a 4-leaf clover, which is the only thing that can kill a leprechaun. There's also another scene that might have been added in the reshoots where Tori is on her way back to the house and comes across the cop's dead body from earlier. She stabs the leprechaun in the eye, and then the leprechaun just rips out the cop's eye and shoves it into his eye socket so that he has a new one. It just feels like a random, gory moment that was probably added to help get the movie an R rating, though I do remember this scene specifically scaring me when I was a little kid, so I can't say that it wasn't an effective addition. But how are the characters going to get a 4-leaf clover? Well, they just look for one. Yeah, and pretty much just in this tiny little area as well. Now, it's said that 4-leaf clovers are pretty rare to find, and most sources say you have about a 1 in 10,000 chance of finding one, and Tori found one. There we go. After the leprechaun finds out his final coin is in Ozzy's stomach, he viciously attacks him, trying to rip him open, but Alex takes the 4-leaf clover, putting it into a slingshot, which is just about the most classic, essential 90s kid thing you could ever see, and then says the ultimate one-liner.
Fuck you, Lucky Charms.
He's a crazy marksman too, because he shoots the clover right in the leprechaun's mouth. My man needs to pick up sharpshooting or something because this accuracy is ridiculous. I also love the melting effects of the leprechaun. It very much reminds me of Stripe from the end of the Gremlins movie. He falls down the well, and then they set the well ablaze, supposedly killing him for good. And of course, the cops show up just as the entire night is over. And we're left just looking at the burning well and hearing the leprechaun's voice as it fades to black, assuming he may still be alive.
Till I find the magic that breaks the spell.
The Leprechaun is obviously a ridiculous movie from the get-go. I can't come at it with any severe film criticisms because it knows exactly what it is and it embraces it. If you can have fun with the concept and revel in Warwick Davis's joyous performance as this evil little creature that loves shoes and gold, then you're gonna have a great time. My only real gripe with the film is that the Leprechaun only kills side characters, and I would have liked to see Nathan, or at least the dad character, kick the bucket. Maybe even Ozzy, the guy that everyone looks down on, heroically sacrificing himself at the end, which, to be fair, was what he planned to do until Alex showed up with the 4-leaf clover. But maybe go all the way with it and actually have his sacrifice go to death. I don't know. That's just a nitpick, though. Truthfully, all I care about is seeing a leprechaun bouncing around gleefully wreaking havoc in the silliest ways possible, and that's what I get here. Maybe it's not a masterpiece, but it's a specific, undeniable part of horror history, and something that you can watch on St. Patrick's Day while you have your pint. It was, of course, mostly panned and shit on by critics upon its release, but also made nearly $9 million on just under a $1 million budget. It's since gone on to, of course, become a cult classic and something that appeals to the die-hard, wacky horror fan sensibilities, and a significant home video push was made later on when Jennifer Aniston got popular on television. And a lot of people have gone back to check it out just out of the pure curiosity to see her in such a bizarre piece of media from the 90s. But what's perhaps even more bizarre than that is just 1 year later, in 1994, Leprechaun would actually get another theatrical sequel. Yes, believe it or not, the first Leprechaun was successful enough to get a sequel, and in 1994, Warwick Davis would return to torment a new set of characters. Right away, The idea was to try to make this a franchise and see if they could capitalize on the success of some of the other horror villains like Freddy Krueger. But in the creation of Leprechaun 2, we begin to set up a precedent that makes trying to figure out the continuity of these movies an actual living nightmare. Mark Jones, who directed the original film, opted not to return this time and was already underway to get another horror comedy off the ground in a similar vein as Leprechaun called Rumpelstiltskin. I have not seen this one myself, but the trailer looks interesting.
Now he must steal a newborn child. Where's the baby? That his evil may live forever.
And once again, I do remember seeing the VHS cover of it in the video store when I was a little kid. So instead, Leprechaun 2 would be directed by Rodman Flender, who's mostly known as a television director, although he did go on to make one of my favorite underrated horror comedies called Idle Hands in 1999.
I have no control over my hands. It makes me do things I don't want him to do.
It stars Devon Sawa, Jessica Alba, and Seth Green, and it falls into that classic horror genre that we all know and love, the killer-possessed hand genre. This is a great film, and unfortunately, I'm not here to talk about Idle Hands today, but I think you should seriously go watch it if you can find it. Instead, I'm here to talk to you guys about Leprechaun 2. Warwick Davis is the only actor to return, which is the most important component, so I'm thankful for that. But our lovable cast of silly characters from the first are neither seen nor mentioned in the second movie. And this begins what I talked about earlier in the sense that the sequels act like tangent universes that don't bother to connect anything to one another. They reinvent the situations and the lore from the ground up and never seem to address anything from the past. Whereas most of the other slasher horror sequels always addressed how their villains were killed at the end of the previous movie in order to have them revived in some over-the-top or contrived sort of way, even like a dog pissing onto its burial site. Good old Nightmare 4.
You shouldn't have buried me. I'm not dead.
But no, not the Leprechaun series. We don't need to see how the Leprechaun gets out of the well because this isn't even the same Leprechaun, and there's plenty of examples as to why. In the first movie, a four-leaf clover was the Leprechaun's weakness. Now, I suppose you can't definitively say that it wouldn't work as a weakness here too, but it's never brought up. Instead, his main weakness in Leprechaun 2 is wrought iron, which will burn his skin if he touches it. Additional lore changes are that in the first movie, when Ozzy had the gold coin in his stomach, the Leprechaun had no problem straight up attacking him, attempting to rip him open. But in part 2, it's a major plot point that if you are in possession of one of the Leprechaun's gold coins, he can't even hurt you. So this is definitely a huge difference, and it means the Leprechaun can't just murder you to take his gold back, you have to give it back to him willingly. And maybe a minor difference, but I think it's worth noting, is that in the first film, when the cop pulls the Leprechaun over, the Leprechaun says he's 600 years old.
No, I'm 600 years old.
In the second movie, which opens up in Ireland back in the year 994, the Leprechaun specifically says it's his 1000th birthday.
Tis a special birthday for a leprechaun. I'm 1000 years old.
Which would make him 2000 years old when the movie switches to modern day. Sure, maybe he was just lying to the police officer, as one does, but all of these changes to me imply at least this has to be a completely different Leprechaun from the original movie, or an alternate timeline altogether. I tend to go with the different Leprechaun theory because I think it's funnier in the sense that every single Leprechaun would look and act exactly the same. And Warwick Davis mentioned that he is always portraying the character the same, so there's no difference in his performance. There's also a bit of confirmation in the documentary behind the scenes where the director says that he considers Leprechaun 2 to essentially be a reboot.
You know, the Leprechaun 2 isn't a direct sequel. It doesn't start where the first one left off. We just went right for a reboot with number 2.
So there you go. The 2 in the title means absolutely nothing. So yeah, this one starts out 1,000 years in the past. We also learn that St. Patrick's Day is the Leprechaun's birthday. Not only that, but this is the only Leprechaun movie in the entire franchise that actually takes place on St. Patrick's Day. So we are really getting into the festivities now. Here, the leprechaun has a slave that's a man that attempted to steal his gold, and for his freedom, the leprechaun aims to marry his daughter, with the condition that she has to sneeze 3 times first, because obviously. But to save his own daughter, he says God bless you, which ruins the sneezes, forgoing his own freedom to save his daughter, and he is promptly killed for it. And so the leprechaun declares that he will return in 1,000 years to marry the man's descendant. Why he needs to wait that long, I'm not really sure. I guess he can only get married on a 1,000th birthday. But then we cut to present day, 1994, and the film is going to take place in the city of Los Angeles. And you know what? I actually like this movie quite a bit. I mean, for Leprechaun standards anyway. Even though it came out in 94, it has a very heavy 80s horror vibe, along with tons of scenes with the Leprechaun just front and center. They don't hide him at all. He's definitely the star of this movie. But I also like the human characters too. The descendant that he plans to marry is a girl named Bridget, played by the actress Chevron Durkin. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but she is absolutely gorgeous. Her acting ability, though...
This is a surprise.
Maybe you should put those in another room or something.
It's not the flowers, but even if it was, it doesn't matter because I love them.
Well, she's still very pretty. Then you got Cody, her boyfriend, who's trying to balance dating her alongside helping his drunken Uncle Morty, who is essentially this movie's George Carlin from Wish. He's actually my favorite character in this one besides the leprechaun himself, so I can't complain too much. He's the stereotype drunken old man trying to make some quick cash and running a subpar business kind of scamming people. It's called The Dark Side Tours. It's a spooky ride through Hollywood, visiting celebrity graves and other alleged locations. And look, it's Clint Howard. If you can get him to take the tour, it's sure to bring in some business. You all know Clint Howard, right? The ice cream man? He's always showing up in everything.
Let's go. This is one of those rip-offs.
But Cody ultimately has to blow off a date with Bridget to drive the tour limo since Morty got too drunk, causing some strain in their relationship.
When are we going to see the death houses?
Meanwhile, in a nearby park, the leprechaun manifests himself, first being disappointed by a bottle of booze, and then taking a homeless man's golden tooth to put into his pot of gold. I think what's fun here that started in Leprechaun 2 and moved into the future movies is that we get to see the leprechaun just out in society. The first movie, as fun as it is, was mostly isolated at the farmhouse. Here we get to see the leprechaun just kind of walking around, waving his magic stick around in public and coming across some businessmen. With as fun as it is to see him interact with normal, everyday people, it makes sense that they would eventually put him in Las Vegas, then into space, and then in the hood, because the more people he has an opportunity to interact with, the funnier the potential can be. He never tries to hide the fact that he's a leprechaun. He never tries to blend in with society. He sticks out like a sore thumb, but he doesn't give a shit about it. And that's the best part. He's gonna do whatever it is he does, and other people just have to deal with it. Bridget gets a ride home from another dude named Ian, and at least has the decency to turn down his physical advances, but man, she didn't even break up with Cody yet. I guess she's just trying to get back to him a little bit. Anyway, Ian really wants some Bridget action.
And what about those chili dogs?
Ian, you better go.
After getting punched and rejected by her, he sees what looks like Bridget in a garage, calling for him to come over in a seductive way. But of course, it's just an illusion from the leprechaun. So you can add getting you to see illusions that aren't actually there as part of his powers in this one. A couple of things here. The illusion Bridget shows her boobs to Ian, which are clearly not the actresses and a body double instead. Also, the original Leprechaun movie never had any nudity or sexual situations, but I guess for a sequel, they just wanted to push it a little bit further. And 3, those are not actually boobs. Those are 2 giant lawnmower blades that are going to rip Ian's face off. Cody goes to Bridget's house in an attempt to apologize and salvage their relationship, but it isn't long before the leprechaun just shows up and gets her to sneeze 3 times. Once again, I love how the leprechaun isn't even trying to be sneaky. He just pops into the kitchen like he owns the place and says he's gonna marry her. It's also here that we learn that the wrought iron can harm him, along with Cody obtaining a gold coin before the leprechaun disappears with Bridget. He takes Bridget to his lair in the park and shows her around, where she gives a similar reaction to girls that I've brought to my house before.
It's awful!
And the first thing he wants to do is get her on the bed and get her pregnant. man, he wastes no time.
Little Irish whiskey, just to put you in the mood.
Okay.
And that just also leads to a slew of other questions about how leprechauns procreate. I mean, we know that all leprechauns are male, and apparently they all look and act like Warwick Davis, but I guess they still need to smash a bride every 1,000 years to make that happen. And apparently the children are supposed to come out as a litter. Look, I don't know, man. Anyway, all of that is put on hold once he realizes he's missing one of his golden coins, meaning that the leprechaun has his priorities straight. Gold first, women second. But he doesn't leave before giving Bridget a good old smooch. After discovering Ian's corpse, everyone assumes that Cody killed him and then kidnapped Bridget, so he's on the run from the cops. Only the old drunken Morty is on his side, believing him to be innocent. Cody tries to convince him of the leprechaun attack, but Morty doesn't believe him, of course.
I don't know what you saw, but leprechauns don't exist. I want Vico!
Once Morty is on board, they go to the bar that is filled with people celebrating St. Patrick's Day. Cody goes to the urinal to take a piss, and then turns around to see a little person offering him a piece of gold chocolate.
It's real milk chocolate.
Believe it or not, this is a very important plot point. But wait, why is he coming into the bathroom in order to offer him some chocolate? He couldn't wait until Cody walked back into the bar? I mean, for God's sakes, he hasn't even washed his hands yet. If you were pissing and you turned around and you saw this guy handing you a piece of candy, would you take it? Sure, he seems trustworthy, but this is not the time or the place for chocolate, man. Anyway, the real leprechaun is also at the bar and just casually shows up next to them. Morty has a great idea to challenge him to a drinking contest, but is actually trying to scam the leprechaun by not really drinking alcohol himself. And it does seem as though being drunk affects the leprechaun's use of his powers, if only for a limited time. In order for him to sober up, the leprechaun heads to a cafe for some coffee with a barista played by Michael McDonald, most famous for Mad TV back in the day, if anybody remembers that, but also many years later, he would be killed by Michael Myers in Halloween Kills. Come to think of it, he was also killed by Mike Myers in Austin Powers. So he's been killed by Mike Myers and Michael Myers and, well, the leprechaun. Cody and Morty attempt to then break into this go-kart racetrack where there's an appropriately sized safe conveniently made of wrought iron that they can trap the leprechaun in, and they actually do manage to get him in there. The problem is, though, that Morty's affinity for wealth and greed is what does him in. Considering this as catching a leprechaun, he then asks for 3 wishes in exchange, his first wish being for the leprechaun's gold. The leprechaun gives it to him by manifesting the pot of gold into his stomach, ultimately having his second and third wishes being to let the leprechaun free and to remove the gold, of which the leprechaun does by force. Now, this may seem like a plot hole since the rules here indicate that the leprechaun cannot harm somebody that's in possession of his gold, but since Morty technically wished for the gold to be removed, I think that works as a loophole. At least that's what I'm going with. But Cody still having a coin is the reason the leprechaun can't kill him. But he can drive a really decked out go-kart and kill a security guard, which is almost just as good. When Cody gets to the leprechaun's lair to try to rescue Bridget, there's a really cool moment that I like where the leprechaun causes a skeleton in the wall to come to life and attack him. It's kind of awesome. I wish there was more shit like this in these movies, other horror elements that can be created or animated by the leprechaun's magic. The leprechaun controlling skeletons? That's badass, and I'm here for it. At one point, Cody stumbles upon Bridget, but it's another illusion by the leprechaun trying to convince him to give up the gold coin. Cody does, and the leprechaun reveals that it was a trick, and you can tell by the super convincing evil laugh that Bridget gives. At least she's cute. But oh wait, it was actually Cody who pulled the real trick by accepting the generous offer of the strange small man in the back of the bathroom stall and taking his chocolate coin. That's what he gave the leprechaun while still holding on to the real coin, which means the moral of the story is not only is it important to accept candy from strangers, but especially if they offer it to you in the bathroom. At least that's what I get from this movie. Cody stabs a beam of wrought iron into the leprechaun and he just fucking explodes. So Cody and Bridget leave, happily ever after, and not to take any chances, Cody tosses the gold coin away. What I'm most surprised about is that there's no twist ending here. There's no tease that the leprechaun isn't really dead. Usually with these horror movies, when they want to attempt to make it into a franchise, they always leave on an ending teaser, but not here. They just walk away and the credits roll. Okay then, I guess we're happy. Not that it matters, since each movie in the Leprechaun franchise is pretty much a different leprechaun anyway, but I was still surprised not to see any kind of twist ending. Anyway, that's Leprechaun 2. I actually think this is a pretty enjoyable little horror movie. It might be more entertaining than the first one at times. You get a little bit more kills here, and at least it kills off a main character with Morty, which is something I felt the first film lacked. You also get more screen time with the leprechaun himself, or at least it feels that way. I didn't actually clock the time, but it definitely feels like you spend more time with him here. It has a very fun, cheesy vibe to it, with plenty of hilarious leprechaun antics, and given the fact that it's actually set on St. Patrick's Day, makes it feel more festive than the original or any of the others, because this is the only movie to be placed on St. Patrick's Day. Personally, I would have preferred it if they tried to connect it to the first movie, but given what we actually have, Leprechaun 2 gives you more of what you want from the franchise, so I can't complain too much. But unfortunately for the box office, a lot of the magic was gone, and though it did make over its budget, bringing in around $2.3 million on a $1.5 million budget, this would be the last theatrically released Leprechaun film, and that's a shame. I've seen way worse horror franchises go on a lot longer in the theaters, but even though Leprechaun would start to become a straight-to-video kind of franchise, that didn't stop them from still trying to strike the iron while it was hot. The budget would only decrease a little bit to around $1.2 million, and the very next year, in 1995, we would get Leprechaun 3.
I prefer cash, but maybe you're a little short.
But even though Leprechaun 3 would be direct-to-video, it did not stop the ambitious nature of the filmmakers and the studio deciding to take the little demon to the city of Las Vegas. Surrounding the creature in a world of neon lights and people filled with greed and debauchery seemed like the ideal setting to throw the leprechaun in, along with giving him an assortment of eccentric characters to interact with and ultimately kill. But it's also unclear how much permission they actually had to shoot in Las Vegas. On the behind-the-scenes documentary, Warwick Davis mentions how quickly they needed to shoot on the city streets of Vegas and then pick up all the camera equipment and shuffle off quickly somewhere else. So whatever permits they needed to have, they probably didn't, which makes it all the more hilarious when you think about it. It was also a collective decision to lean way more into the wacky, humorous side of the franchise and not even really try to make a passable horror movie this time around. For better or worse, they accomplished this goal, and Leprechaun 3 becomes the most absurd and ridiculous movie in the series so far. The script was written by David Dubose, who admitted to never seeing the first two Leprechaun movies before getting the job. And as for the director, they went with Brian Trenchard Smith, who had just made Night of the Demons 2. I have seen the first Night of the Demons movie, and it's pretty fun, but I have not seen the sequel. So if you have, let me know if it's any good. Now, the second Leprechaun movie did not connect to the first one, but this was only Leprechaun 3. If they wanted to, they could have decided to find a way to connect them because this was so early on. But nope, the Leprechaun is introduced right away, frozen in stone. Let's see, at the end of the first movie, he's melting in a well that's on fire, and at the end of the second, he straight up explodes. Neither of which I imagine would result in a statue form, not to mention almost all of the rules and weaknesses are once again changed, so we continue believing that this is either an entirely different Leprechaun or an alternate universe altogether. You decide. What is similar is that the leprechaun is once again obsessed with his gold, and when a shilling goes missing, he's off to find who's taken it in order to get it back. But the major differences here, unlike in part 2, is that he once again is completely capable of harming whoever has the golden coin, and it doesn't offer them any immunity. So that's no longer an issue. But also, whoever has the gold coin can use it to make a wish, meaning that the leprechaun himself doesn't have to grant the wish, it comes from the coin, with the only restriction being that you cannot use the wish to harm the leprechaun. But honestly, this is kind of a pretty great element of the movie because the coin constantly shifts hands between the characters as they become aware of its power, and they all end up making very selfish wishes that backfire at some point, which is a concept that I actually really like.
Whose balls were made of fine brass. So in stormy weather, they both clanged together, and sparks flew out of his ass.
Now, as far as the leprechaun weaknesses go here, neither the four-leaf clover or the wrought iron are brought up or used at all. They're not even mentioned, so maybe they work, but we'll never know. Instead, we have two other potential methods. There is a medallion that's on the leprechaun statue, which is what turns him to stone, and he also fears it. Once it's removed, he comes back to life. But they don't really explain anything about this medallion beyond that, where it comes from or why it has such an effect on him. But hey, doesn't this amulet kind of look very similar to the Heart of Damballa from the Chucky franchise? I think we may have just found our access point on how to bring these two franchises together. Yes, I'm saying it right now. This is a voodoo magic amulet endowed with the powers of Damballa that subdues the leprechaun, and that's how we can connect it to Chucky. Okay, I know I'm reaching here, but it looks the same to me. The only other method used to stop the leprechaun, which is used in the finale, is to destroy the leprechaun's gold, which I guess is similar to the first movie where the gold acts as a source of power, so if you destroy that source, then you also destroy the leprechaun. The cast of Leprechaun 3 is also such a strange blend of people known for other more popular things. For instance, the lead actor John Gattens, who plays Scott, went on to be a screenwriter in Hollywood and even nominated for an Academy Award for the screenplay for Flight. So yeah, when you're looking at this half man, half leprechaun, just know he went on to be nominated for an Academy Award. That's awesome. Caroline Williams is in this movie as well, who's more well known for a different horror franchise, playing Stretch in Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2. And also the guy that plays the magician Fazio went on to be a prominent voice actor in a bunch of famous anime series like Naruto, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and One Punch Man. So yeah, somehow the stars aligned and all these random people that went on to be famous for other things all happened to be in Leprechaun 3 together. Now, there's no flashback opening here. We just start in the middle of Las Vegas, where a man brings the leprechaun statue into a pawn shop and tells the clerk not to remove the medallion no matter what. But what does he do? He removes the medallion, and the leprechaun comes to life and starts cracking jokes and letting us know that he really does have a thing for feet in this one.
Ah, don't mind if I do.
The shopkeeper manages to keep him at bay for a while with the medallion, but eventually the leprechaun gets around that and realizes he has a shilling of his gold, so he calmly asks for it back.
Where's me shilling? I want me shilling!
Actually, doesn't the scene remind you of anything?
Where's my money? You gonna give me my money? Where's my money, man?
Where's me shilling? I want me shilling!
Meanwhile, our lead character, Scotty, drives into Las Vegas and gives a magician's assistant named Tammy a lift to the casino that she works at that's called the Lucky Shamrock, which is the closest to any St. Patrick's Day references that we're going to get here. Scotty starts to gamble, and it's not long before he loses all of his cash. We also get introduced to a cast of wacky characters that work here and all of their various quirks setting up their deaths later on. Fazio is a magician with a failing act where nothing works right. Loretta wants plastic surgery so that she can look younger and hotter. And Mitch, the owner, is arrogant, thinking that due to his wealth and power, he can get any woman that he wants. These are all fun enough surface-level characters, and they work fine here that you can't wait to see them die. But our lead characters, Scott and Tammy, they are just not interesting at all, and they're a massive step down from the protagonist of Leprechaun 1 and 2. It's one of those films where the side characters are so much more amusing than the leads. But anyways, after losing all of his money, Scott goes to the pawn shop to sell his watch for more money because he's too dumb to realize that he's getting scammed, and comes across the dead shopkeeper and the leprechaun. This is where we get our first instance of the wish-granting potential. He wishes he was back at the casino and on a winning streak, and just that happens. The coin directs him to all of the correct winning numbers on the roulette table, and this actually becomes my favorite element of the movie. The wish-granting coin was a fun MacGuffin, not just for the leprechaun to pursue to try to get back, but also how everyone gets their hand on the coin at one point or another to try to take advantage of its power. We also get to see the leprechaun just walk into the casino, and once again, he's not even trying to hide or be inconspicuous. He just jauntily walks across the street. He meets an Elvis impersonator. He hands the magician a piece of shit, which I guess proves that leprechaun poop is green. So in case you ever wanted to know that fact about leprechauns, if you yourself poop green, it could be an indication of many leafy greens in your diet, or maybe you have diarrhea, but it could also mean that you're a leprechaun. And the leprechaun even starts gambling himself. And I love how nobody questions how he looks. I mean, a couple characters comment on what he's wearing, but no one mentions his skin or his sharp claws or anything else about him. I guess this being Las Vegas, they've probably seen stranger things.
Vegas, my kind of town.
But what I think is the most strange about this movie is the whole subplot of Scott becoming a leprechaun. See, the leprechaun attacks Scott for his gold coin and bites his arm as well as bleeds on it, which slowly, over the rest of the movie, begins to transform Scott into a leprechaun as well. But this doesn't really have a ton of consequence, and at the end of the day, doesn't matter. First is just the implication. I mean, is this how all leprechauns are created in this universe? It's like a werewolf curse. And it also is completely unintentional from the leprechaun. It just happens by accident. Not to mention, there's also a plot point that states leprechauns are territorial and they don't like other leprechauns around them. But Scott and the leprechaun already had a reason to be antagonistic towards another, so I don't see why that was necessarily needed. And for most of the rest of the movie, Scott shifts back and forth between acting more like a leprechaun and then acting more like himself, but is also able to restrain his sense of self enough to fight back at times. And I don't know, I guess it was just a weird idea that made it into the final product, but I'll be honest, I'm not really a fan of it. Loretta, who was running the roulette table, is able to realize that the coin must be what was helping Scott win before, but before she gets a chance to take it and use it herself, Mitch comes by, taking the coin from her, and without even knowing it, wishes that he could hook up with Tammy. And so, Tammy shows up by his side, wanting him to bang her right there and then. She also really likes it rough, apparently.
Ooh, that's wonderful.
I don't know if that's part of the magic or if that's just her real personality. They go up to his room, but before they can get it on, Loretta snatches the coin back, undoing his wish, and Tammy runs out, assuming Mitch did something weird to her, which is terrible for both sides. I can't imagine what she'd be feeling, but also, I mean, Mitch didn't really have any idea of the coin's power. He just assumed she was actually into him. So even though he's kind of a dick, this part wasn't really his fault. Not to worry, though, because soon enough he gets to make love to a robot. Yeah, so the leprechaun comes in to kill him using magic, which makes Mitch hallucinate a woman coming out of the TV, but then she turns into a sex robot with massive boobs. I don't even really understand what's happening here. Are we assuming that the robot is real? Because it does electrocute him to death. So does that mean that the leprechaun built a robot? Or did the robot already exist and the leprechaun just brought it here and took control of it? Is it all a hallucination? If so, how did he get electrocuted? Where did the robot come from? I honestly have no idea. I've just always said that the robot apocalypse is probably going to start with the sex bots. And this just further confirms my suspicions. The next wish is from Loretta, who wants to be young and sexy once again, but when the leprechaun catches up to her, her enhancements become her downfall. He literally kills her by having her boobs and ass grow so gigantic that they explode. I guess BBL in this instance stands for bloody butt lift.
What a lovely lass. I had to blow up your ass.
Now, Scott and Tammy team up and search for clues on how to reverse the leprechaun curse and to kill it, and coming after them, the leprechaun gives one of the best lines of all time.
For pulling this trick, I'll chop off your dick!
They eventually wind up at the hospital, and two super funny moments happen here. First, the doctors see how much money that Scott has on him and immediately discuss all of these medical tests they want to give him, whereas they didn't really care too much beforehand. And then we actually have the Leprechaun showing up, this time attempting to be a little incognito by dressing in hospital scrubs. Yeah, he's even got a little clipboard. I don't know what to say. This is amazing. Scott's leprechaun transformation gets a little bit more intense, and he's able to utilize magic a bit as well, but once the leprechaun realizes that neither of them have his coin, and instead it's with the magician, he leaves the hospital in order to go collect it. The finale of the movie takes place at the magic show, as Fazio has been using the coin to wish that he was the world's greatest magician. But the leprechaun shows up to show him some tricks of his own, with the classic cut the body in half gag. Except here, there's no trick. He just cuts him in half. And it is also great seeing the leprechaun with a chainsaw. I need some more of that. I also wonder how the leprechaun decides whether he's going to kill somebody with magic or just, beat them over the head or chop them in half with a chainsaw. It's interesting how he goes back and forth. Unfortunately, I think the ending of this movie is pretty lackluster. Scott and Tammy arrive and realize since the gold is the source of his power, they just need to use a flamethrower to destroy the gold, which also incinerates the leprechaun and reverses the curse. Nah, I don't like it. I also don't think this should even work because they still have a single gold coin at the end that is not destroyed, so wouldn't that mean that some of his power still exists? I also think that it would have been better if it didn't alleviate the curse and Scott just became the new leprechaun at the end, fully transforming into another Warwick Davis, thus defeating one leprechaun and letting loose another. But no, for the second time in a row, we end one of these movies with no cliffhanger and with a happy couple walking off in the distance together. Extremely bland stuff. But at one time, Trimark figured that Leprechaun 3 was going to be the last movie they'd make, so I guess this would have been the ending of the original trilogy. Look, I think the premise of Leprechaun 3 is great. Yes, throw him into Las Vegas and have him get up to a bunch of silly antics there. Have a bunch of quirky characters for him to kill. It's all fantastic. But everything involving Scott and Tammy just kinda sucks and is the most boring part of the film. The highlights are, of course, all of the kill scenes and the leprechaun just hanging out and interacting with random people in the casino. And in that respect, it's worth the watch. And I don't know how ridiculous this is to say since I'm talking about Leprechaun movies, but the story and the characters were way better in the first two. I'd seen Leprechaun 3 before, but before rewatching it, I couldn't remember anything about the protagonist. And then 10 minutes after I finished rewatching it, I also don't really remember anything about them. Scott being turned into a leprechaun is about it, and it might have been an okay premise if they had a true magic fight at the end or a twist ending where he became the leprechaun, but I also don't like the idea of the leprechaun being a curse like a werewolf. It just seems unnecessary. I like them being their own sort of magical being. But of course, Warwick Davis is once again amazing, and the humor is ramped up from the first two, and I really like the concept of the wishing coin, so overall, I'd say this one is okay. It's not one of the best, but not the worst. But now that we've discussed Leprechaun 3, I can talk about what I really want to talk about. And one of the main reasons I decided to make this video. Because after Leprechaun 3, 2 years later, they would decide to make another direct-to-video movie. A film so captivating and phenomenal that it breaks all barriers and becomes a magnificent work of cinematic art unlike that which you've ever seen before. A movie that holds the power to change lives and impact the world on such a scale that others like Citizen Kane and The Godfather must simply bow down beneath its godlike presence. A movie in which all other movies should aspire to hit the peaks of the greatest movie ever made, Leprechaun 4 in space.
You ball-busting bitch.
One may ask what makes a great movie, Is it compelling characters? Is it a good twist at the end? Is it showing lots of titties? All of those things are great. But what's the thing that makes a movie truly special to stand the test of time? I think it's taking it to space. All right, you put the leprechaun of all creatures in the world into space, and amazing things can happen. People can get turned into giant monstrous spiders. A man's ball sack can explode. Lightsabers exist. What else? That's probably it. Oh, also nunchucks! Yes, nunchucks! Nunchucks! I shit you guys not, that when I saw Leprechaun 4 in space for the first time, I almost put it at my favorite movie of all time. I'm coming up with a list right now where I'm gonna give you guys a ranking of my top 100 films, and the restraint I am trying to give myself to not put Leprechaun 4 in space at number 1 is driving me crazy. Like, I'm trying to be objective here, but I just can't. Leprechaun 4 in space is one of the greatest achievements in cinematic history, and I can't wait to talk about it. So we're gonna dive into what I think is the greatest movie of all time. Fuck Citizen Kane, fuck Seven Samurai, fuck The Godfather, Leprechaun 4 in space. Let's get it, baby.
Yes, Leprechaun 4 takes us into the deep reaches of outer space and into the futuristic year of 2096. A lot of people would say that when a horror franchise suddenly decides to make a space movie like Hellraiser Bloodline or Jason X, that means that the series is officially dead. That's of course a horror series that doesn't start out in space like Alien. But in the case of Leprechaun 4, I think this is where the franchise reaches its peak. This is the most entertaining and absurdist movie of the entire franchise, and I absolutely love it for that reason. It has no purpose or place with any of the other films, but for some reason, this is the one that I have the most fun watching. This is the kind of movie that you want to get a group of friends together and laugh your asses off while having some drinks. And I'll stand on the hill that if Leprechaun 4 has any die-hard fans out there in the world, I am one of them. I want to watch this movie every day. I want to watch this movie with my future wife on our wedding night. I want this movie played at my funeral. It's that good. Brian Trenchard Smith returns from Leprechaun 3 to direct this one as well, which also makes him the only person to direct multiple Leprechaun movies, a title I hope he holds with the utmost of honor. So after the Leprechaun in Vegas approach worked very well for Trimark, as far as direct-to-video movies go anyway, they decided to put the Leprechaun in some other kind of environment that would be exciting. And going with a bit of a spoof approach to the movie Aliens, with Marines out in space battling a creature, except this time, the creature would be Warwick Davis as the Leprechaun. But yes, once again, this movie has no obvious connection to any of the other films and can pretty much take place entirely in a different universe, or I guess in this case in the future. It's so disconnected that they in fact never say the word leprechaun in the entire movie. They just call it a creature or a monster. And it's almost as if the characters in the film have never even heard of the concept of a leprechaun before, because nobody comments on it. It's never explained to them. They don't know what his powers are. They don't mention anything about Ireland or St. Patrick's Day. It makes you wonder if this leprechaun is even from Earth, or if this is just some kind of space leprechaun that's always existed. Or maybe leprechauns are not specifically Earth creatures, but they actually exist everywhere in the universe. Imagine if every planet is just overrun with leprechauns. So yes, he is still very possessive over his gold, although the plot this time does not focus around the fact that the leprechaun wants to get his gold back from somebody that has it. At least not till the very end. Instead, this is more similar to Leprechaun 2, where he wants a bride. Except this time, instead of forcing her to be with him, he dresses up like a distinguished gentleman and decides to wine and dine her, trying his best to be as smooth as he can.
A little of the bubbly to put us on more friendly terms.
Of course, nothing works until he shows her how wealthy he is. That's where the gold comes into play. And then suddenly she starts to come around. This is a princess of some planet that I forget the name of and that we'll never see, but her name is Zarina, and she wears a gold bikini the entire film, as well as being completely coated in some kind of glittery substance. Because if you're thinking of an alien princess girl, what other ideas for her look would you possibly come up with? They also secretly hate each other and both plan to kill one another once they overthrow the king on her planet, but we never get to see her planet and that never happens. And as far as leprechaun weaknesses go in this one, I don't think he even has any. He gets blown to pieces on 3 separate occasions in this movie and manages to reform himself in one way or another. Since they never bring up the fact that he's a leprechaun, they never mention anything about a 4-leaf clover, or wrought iron, or destroying his gold. They mostly just shoot at him with guns. And for the leprechaun himself, although he does still have magical abilities, obviously being able to regenerate from practically anything and disguise himself to look like other people, but a lot of times he just picks up a gun and shoots back at them. Yeah, in the beginning where the Marines rush into the leprechaun's cave, he just grabs one of their guns and starts blasting.
Yes. I don't know if they wanted money or they wanted something more sexual. Anyway, I started blasting. Bang! Bang!
Who needs magic when you have guns? And that's not even the only time he uses guns in the movie. It turns out to be a pretty regular thing. The Marines are sent in specifically to destroy the creature in the beginning, hired by the mysterious Dr. Mittenhand, who only communicates via video screen and who I guess is also German.
Have your orders, Sergeant? I suggest you follow them.
On the team of Marines, there is Sergeant Hooker, who's a character that was originally supposed to be played by R. Lee Ermey from Full Metal Jacket, but his agents didn't want him to stoop as low as to do a Leprechaun movie, so he ultimately didn't take the role. Funny enough, the actor that does play the Sergeant, Tim Kilsuri, was also up for Ermey's role in Full Metal Jacket, but ultimately ended up playing a much smaller role as one of the gunners in a different scene, but still a memorable scene.
You just don't lead him so much! Ain't war hell?
We have our main standard action hero books that the director stated he wanted him to just do a Sylvester Stallone impression the entire movie, but decided against it last minute in case they got sued. And then we also have Tina Reeves, who is the new addition to the team that nobody quite respects because she's a girl, which actually doesn't even make a lot of sense because there already is another girl on their team. But whatever. Books and Tina are basically our discount Hicks and Ripley from Aliens, but I like them. They both know exactly what kind of movie this is, and they play into it well. They're not deep, complex characters, they're just standard stock action heroes, and that's fine. There's also this character Styx, played by Miguel A. Nunez Jr., and I love when this guy shows up in horror movies because when he does, you know it's going to be a ridiculous ride. He's in Return of the Living Dead, Friday the 13th Part 5, and he also plays DJ in the Street Fighter movie. Yeah, freaking love this guy. As the Marines enter the Leprechaun's lair, there's this one shot of a weird alien-looking monster that I guess is meant to be like the Leprechaun's security alarm, but we never see this creature again, and it's never once mentioned what it is or why it's there. Also, when the Marines attack the Leprechaun, he fights back not just with their own guns, but also a lightsaber. Yeah, the lead actor couldn't do a Stallone impression because they might get sued, but they can also straight up rip off a lightsaber from Star Wars and nobody cares. I guess you can get around it by saying it's just a laser sword, but it's great. What's better than seeing the Leprechaun use a chainsaw? Seeing the Leprechaun use a lightsaber. But perhaps in the most noble act the Leprechaun ever performs, he throws himself on a grenade in order to protect the princess and gets blown to pieces for the first of 3 times in this movie. One of the Marines decides to piss on his corpse, which was the worst idea you could do because somehow, via magic, I guess, the Leprechaun's essence goes up the guy's piss stream into his body, and once they get back to the spaceship, the Marine tries to get it on with the other girl in the group, and his dick starts to feel very weird. And in the greatest Leprechaun reveal ever, the man's dick grows so huge that the Leprechaun bursts out of it like a newborn baby, giving us a solid piece of life advice.
Let that be a lesson to you, lad. Always wear a prophylactic.
So the leprechaun comes out of the man's penis. I said, yes, I like it.
Afterwards, the Leprechaun starts to stalk the corridors of the ship, killing a few more characters whose names and personalities never matter to begin with, but what does matter is Dr. Mittenhand's plan. See, he's actually aboard the ship, and the reason that he only talks through the video screens is because he looks like this. He's a German cyborg, and you know those are the worst kind. After discovering the alien princess also has some regenerative abilities, he wants to experiment with her DNA in order to create a cure that will forcefully regenerate the rest of his human body. And in making sure the Leprechaun doesn't get her, he commands them to keep her safe and track down the creature. threatening to charge them for mutiny if they disagree. I guess for what passes as tension, there's a lot of scenes of the Marines walking down small, dark corridors with their guns, mostly referencing aliens over and over again, as well as our two lead characters having some fun banter back and forth, acting at first like they hate each other, but subtly upping the sexual tension as the movie goes on. You've seen it a million times. But I also wonder who's really in the wrong here. I mean, the Leprechaun is just looking for his soon-to-be bride, and although it wasn't quite the most consensual thing, she did agree to it. And also, the Marines don't even want to be here. They don't have an emotional incentive to fight back. They're just following orders. They came into the Leprechaun's home during his date and blew him up. I think it's fair that he drops a few heavy boxes on him.
Smashing, simply smashing, falling.
When the group corners the Leprechaun in the walkway, Dolores shoots him to the point where he explodes for the second time, and thankfully she doesn't piss on him, but he just ends up reforming anyway and throws her off the walkway. It makes me wonder if the Leprechauns from the other three movies could just reform themselves if they were blown up. I know the other time we saw the Leprechaun blow up was at the end of part 2, but that was at the result of one of his weaknesses, so if he just blew up from artillery, could he just reform himself to begin with? But like I said, nobody in this movie even calls or references him as a leprechaun, so none of his weaknesses are discussed or figured out. Eventually, the Leprechaun does find his alien princess, disguising himself as Tina to get into the lab room, and quickly kills Mittenhand's assistant by throwing a plate so hard that it flattens his face. Literally. Then once the princess wakes up, there's kind of a nice moment where her and the Leprechaun get to bond over the idea of torturing Dr. Mittenhand. It's nice to see a girl actually enjoy being with him. Maybe the Leprechaun needed a character like this, like the Tiffany to his Chucky. Something about a leprechaun and a glittering princess from outer space, I don't know, seems like a good pairing to me. They decide to blend up the regenerative DNA concoction with a spider and a scorpion, put it all together and inject it into Mittenhand's head, which ultimately results in the craziest and most unexpected aspect of this movie I'll get to in a second. But first, the Leprechaun needs to shoot some more guns. Hell yeah, fuck using magic. There's no time for that. Just blast some holes into them. Zarina also helps the Leprechaun out by showing the Marines her boobs.
This is your fate.
I don't exactly know what this was meant to accomplish. I suppose a distraction, but that's all she does.
Look upon them and know that you are forever doomed.
Meanwhile, we discover the sergeant was actually a cyborg the entire time, and the Leprechaun is able to take control over him, making him dress in drag and dance around. Yeah, this movie's just getting better and better. There's literally no purpose for any of this, but it's right here, leading up to the most random but amazing line delivery in the history of cinema.
Nunchucks!
I have no words for this. Every time I see the sergeant pull out nunchucks and start swinging them around, I just think, was the screenwriter stoned? And if he was, thank God he was.
Fuck! I'm gonna take him out! 6, no!
He's gonna kill us.
If you ever want to know what my kind of humor is, it's whatever this scene is. It's sad to see the sergeant go, but the movie's going to get even crazier after this because the DNA from earlier has now mutated Dr. Mittenhand into a monstrous abomination to all mankind, literally renaming himself Mitten Spider. That's canon. That's not a fan term. He actually declares himself, with all of the authority he can muster, Mitten Spider.
I am now Mitten Spider.
That's his actual new name that you must refer to him as from this point forward. No other Leprechaun movie has a giant mutated German cyborg man-spider scorpion hybrid beast creature in it, and I think therefore we have definitive reason as to why Leprechaun Part 4 is the best in the entire series. Meanwhile, in the last act of this movie, the Leprechaun suddenly remembers to look for his gold, and it's been stashed in the cargo bay. And what I love also is that he's already getting so annoyed with his princess nagging him, and they've been together for like 10 minutes. That's pretty funny.
You ball-busting bitch.
What did you say?
But his gold has been shrunk down in size due to a device that can, change the size of things because this is future technology or whatever. And that technology, when reversed, can also make things grow gigantic. And yes, I am telling you, you get a kaiju-sized leprechaun in this movie. Once again, proof that this is the best movie ever.
Big is good.
Also, Books ends up shirtless fighting him because, why not? It's the best movie ever. You gotta see his muscles. And Tina gets half of her clothes ripped off. Why not? Because it's the best movie ever and you gotta see it. Styx and Tina actually get tangled up in a flesh-like webbing of Dr. Mitten Spider having to face him down. There's a chase scene that ensues and some gross special effects here and there. Basically a battle between a half-naked blonde woman and a giant mutant spider beast. That's what you pay your money for. It's exactly what you never knew you wanted in a Leprechaun movie, but now you desperately need. Ultimately, she ends up getting some liquid nitrogen, freezing Dr. Mitten Spider, and then blasting him to pieces. Books knocks out the princess and carries her to safety for some reason, because, she was helping the leprechaun the entire time, so I don't think he needed to, but I guess he's just being a gentleman and a true hero. Anyway, he opens the airlocks, blasting the kaiju-sized leprechaun into space, where he blows up for the third and final time in the movie. I also love this line delivery from Styx when the characters all reconvene and Books and Tina kiss each other.
Yeah! Okay, I guess I don't get that.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
My main question is, can't the leprechaun just reform himself like he did the other two times? He actively gives them the middle finger with his severed giant hand, so he still has some control over his body. Why would being giant stop him from reforming? Or maybe it has something to do with the vacuum of space being able to stop him. I don't know, and we'll never know, because the movie just ends. But regardless of all the burning unanswered questions about the leprechaun's immortality, what's not a question in my mind is how amazing Leprechaun 4 in Space is as a film. This movie is totally bonkers from start to finish, it wastes no time, and it never bothers to try to justify its existence. It's exactly what it claims to be. It's the Leprechaun in space. Does it make any sense? No. Does it need to? Also no. You got space marines, spider monsters, naked alien princesses, wacky technology, cyborgs, cross-dressing nunchuck-wielding sergeants, and all the greatest Hollywood writers and AI combined could not recreate something as special as this. Stream this movie now, watch it any way you can, DVD, Blu-ray, is there a 4K? I don't know. Just see it in every way possible. And know that after you watch it, every other movie from this point forward will be nothing short of a disappointment, never reaching the highs of Leprechaun 4. But for some reason, this movie was not very well received. I don't really understand. It did not get as many direct-to-video sales as Leprechaun 3 did, and seemed to be disregarded with the other horror and space movies. So because of that, it would take 3 more years before another Leprechaun movie would be made. But where can you go after going to space? Well, there's only one answer to that. That's right. You go to the hood.
So I needed a beer because we're done talking about the greatest movie of all time and we have to bring ourselves back down to earth in order to talk about Leprechaun in the Hood. Lep in the Hood, up to do no good, as they say. So here we are. This beer's been sitting in the fridge for quite a while. Anyways, here we are in the middle of the hood talking about 2 back-to-back Leprechaun in the Hood movies that have, again, nothing to do with one another. First, we're going to the hood, and then we're gonna go back to the hood, but in spirit only, because, like I said, I don't even think it's the same hood, to be honest, but then again, I guess I don't really know for sure. But these movies are important for a number of reasons. Number 1 is you get to see Warwick Davis rap, which is amazing. But number 2 is also because these are the last 2 movies with Warwick Davis. Unfortunately, we do have 2 Leprechaun movies to cover that will not feature him. So let's enjoy this moment while we have it and appreciate the final 2 films of Warwick Davis as the Leprechaun, as he has a variety of adventures within the Hood.
Yeah, so when it came to where should we take the Leprechaun next, plenty of options came to mind, not the least of which was an idea where the Leprechaun would be in the White House, and they were planning on making fun of an exaggerated version of Bill Clinton, which pretty much just would have been Bill Clinton, and I think that would have been a great potential for a movie. But ultimately, that did not go through, and instead they went in favor of the Hood, because I guess a large demographic of Leprechaun fans live in the Hood. I have no clue if that's true or not. That's what Warwick Davis says on the special features, but somehow it makes sense. Once again, this would go direct to video and would also be the last Leprechaun film that was distributed by Trimark before the company disbanded, and eventually Lionsgate would take over the franchise. It also came out in the year 2000. Yeah, we're stepping out of the 90s now and into the new millennium, and this time the movie would be directed by Rob Spera, who made the first of the Witchcraft movie franchise, an extremely low-budget series that somehow on this God's green earth has actually managed to spawn 16 sequels. I have no idea about it, but he directed the first one, so I guess that says something. Anyway, Leprechaun 5 now drops the number in its titling and just calls itself Leprechaun in the Hood. Normally I hate when sequels drop the numbering because at that point it requires a little bit more research on your part in order for you to know what the correct order to watch them is. But in the case of the Leprechaun that has never had any continuity anyway, it's actually a lot more forgivable here. In fact, they probably should have just done this from the start since the numbering system is completely irrelevant with no connectivity between any of the films. Oddly enough, though, this movie does take some lore elements seen in the others, which is really shocking to see. For instance, the Leprechaun is introduced turned to stone with the same kind of necklace that was around him that we saw in Leprechaun 3 that did the same thing. Now, once again, this can't be the same Leprechaun from part 3 because the opening of this movie takes place in the 70s where he's turned to stone and the necklace is not removed until present day, the year 2000. So all of the events of Leprechaun 1 through 3 that take place in the 90s would just not work here. So not only would that infer that there's multiple leprechauns, but also multiple medallions that freeze them into stone. They also bring up the 4-leaf clover for the first time since the original. Though this time, the 4-leaf clover does not kill the leprechaun, it only depowers him for a certain amount of time. And even though they never mention wrought iron as a form of a weakness, like they did in Leprechaun 2, they do have the same exact scenario play out where the characters briefly manage to trap the leprechaun inside of a safe. So this proves to me at least one thing. The writers of this movie at least actually watched the other Leprechaun films before making this one, and in a series like this, that goes a long way. They even open the movie with the same footage from the opening of Leprechaun 1, but this has a different monologue overdub from the Leprechaun, talking about how a lep in the hood is usually up to no good. Now yes, the movie does start out in the 1970s, and you know this because everybody has a massive afro. And we introduce one of our characters, Mac Daddy Onassis, played by the one and only Ice-T. Ice-T is a famous rapper, and during the late 90s, early 2000s era, it was pretty common for rap music artists to end up in horror movies. And I'm completely down for that, except for just don't remind me about Halloween Resurrection, and we'll be okay.
Trick or treat, motherfucker.
Anyway, you would think that Ice-T is the main character since he's the only person they bother putting on the cover and poster art for the movie other than Warwick Davis, and his name is right there front and center, but he's actually barely in this movie. His biggest scenes are all within the first act, beginning with the opening where he and a friend find the leprechaun's gold, and after removing the necklace, his friend is quickly killed by his afro hair comb. But with the most bullshit stroke of luck imaginable, the necklace goes flying up into the air and lands immediately back on the leprechaun, returning him to stone just mere minutes after being unstoned. In fact, he would go on to be quite stoned within the rest of this movie. So Mac Daddy takes the leprechaun's wealth and magic flute and uses the resources to become a successful record producer living within the hood. Our real main characters are 3 young friends trying to make it big with their rap music. Now, I don't really know anything about rap music. I'm a heavy metal and pop punk kind of guy. Warped Tour was my jam. So I'm not the best judge of their talents or credibility, but they seem to have some skill, and they performed their rap songs in like a third of this movie.
What I'm bringing, see, the crew and me,
we all got unity.
So there's no shortage of the vibe of the hood, as well as having your typical hood conversations while walking back in the alleyways.
See, our unconscious beliefs control our behavior. Only through daily positive affirmation can we overcome, man.
Postmaster P is the name of our protagonist, and he wants to write music with a positive, uplifting message, while his friends, named Stray Bullet and Butch, are more concerned with the success that they make and trying to make money, regardless of what it takes to do it. When they get a chance to show their music to Mac Daddy hates it, and instead wants them to make lyrics about shooting guns and smashing hoes. So it comes down to integrity. Do you follow the masses of what sells, or do you hold true to what your art means to you? Well, Post is the only character that wants to hold back, as the others would rather just change their sound and do what it takes to get paid. But ultimately, Mac Daddy throws them out on their asses, and so the boys decide to rob him. And they also have more typical conversations that you would have between friends.
My nigga, man. I love you, man. Love you, man. Shit, let's go to Vegas. Word, let's do this, homie.
Post goes with them reluctantly, and during the break-in, they remove the medallion from the Leprechaun statue and once again awaken him to wreak some havoc. Yes, in typical fashion, he wants his gold, but in this movie, it's more specifically that he wants his magic flute back. When used, this flute can freeze somebody in their tracks and also put them under your control. There's a great scene with Mac Daddy after being robbed where he runs to hide from the leprechaun in the bathroom, but there he shows up. And to mellow the leprechaun out and to briefly win him over, he passes the little dude a joint.
Curious aroma. Interesting blend. A friend with weed is a friend indeed.
And I honestly feel like it's completely in character for the leprechaun to smoke weed. I just think it would be better if he did it out of an old-timey pipe. Well, he doesn't completely let Mac Daddy off the hook because he rips off one of his fingers, but leaves him alive so that he can go look for the thieves as well. So essentially, the whole middle portion of this movie are the three boys running from place to place in the hood, getting tracked down by both Mac Daddy and the leprechaun. Which is all well and good, but maybe it would have been better if Mac Daddy was turned into a giant spider monster. I don't know. That could just be my personal taste. They take refuge at someone's house, and look, I don't want to get this wrong and have people rage at me. I'm not trying to be insensitive. To me, this person looks like what I would assume is a transvestite, just a dude that likes dressing up in women's clothing. I don't think it's anything more than that, but whatever is going on here, the boys know him or her and manage to stay here for a bit and perform another rap song. And when the leprechaun shows up, the transvestite thinks he's just a paying customer. But when the leprechaun says he's looking for his magic flute, he says that he's found it.
Hell no, to the no.
Oddly enough, the leprechaun goes along with this, and it's not until they're in bed together that the leprechaun kills him. So I guess maybe Leprechaun wanted to try it out and then decided he didn't like it, and that's when it was time to choke him out. Or maybe they were getting into it and things just got a little too rough. I don't know. I'm not here to judge. So needing to run away again, the next place they go is the church. And the reverend, knowing that they're musicians, wants them to sing at the service. At first, their lyrics fail to impress the audience.
Jesus loves me, this I know. If he don't, I'll find a hope.
But as soon as Coolio shows up, wait, Coolio. Yeah, that's actually him. He's credited in this movie. Again, I'm not a rap person, so I don't really know too much about Coolio. I know pretty much two things. He made Gangsta's Paradise, as well as the Keenan and Kel intro song.
Oh, here it goes.
That's all I got. But he literally does nothing in this movie. He doesn't even have a single line of dialogue. He just shows up in the church scene in the background. It's almost as if he didn't even know what movie he was in, and somebody just convinced him to stand in front of the camera for a few seconds. And unlike Ice-T, he's not playing a character. He's literally just Coolio. But between Coolio's presence and a little help from the magic flute, the church sermon gets a little bit better.
Jesus works in a mysterious way, that ain't no answer. We gonna do it our way.
Now, when the boys are confronted in the hallway by Mac Daddy and his henchmen and the Leprechaun 2, the Leprechaun fires like a magic missile blowing a hole in the henchman's gut. And my question is, if the Leprechaun can do this with just a flick of his wrist, why doesn't he do it to everyone? It seems like it would be a pretty easy way to get all of his shit back. They never mention whether or not he can harm the possessor of his flute. He never does, but it's never specifically stated that he can't, so I don't know. Eventually, they trap him in a safe similar to part 2, but this time, in order to escape, the Leprechaun calls upon his hose. No, I'm not kidding. In this movie, the Leprechaun has hoes. They do his bidding, and it's even implied that he actively bangs them all, which makes this the horniest Leprechaun in all the movies. I mean, at least in part 2, he wanted to have a proper bride, and in part 4, he took the princess on a date first. Here, he just mind controls a bunch of women and then has them do his bidding, if you catch my drift. One day in the hood, and he's already pimping. But it works because the girls let him out, and he kills the priest.
Praise be, good Reverend.
Our trio performs yet another rap show, which I think is like the 4th one in this movie. It's basically a musical at this point. And they're on the cusp of going to Vegas and getting a record deal. But Leprechaun shows up alongside his bitches, demanding the flute back and threatening to kill Butch. Post reluctantly gives it up, but after a failed attempt to bum rush him, he controls Stray Bullet and has him shoot himself in the face. And I'm just now realizing how ironic his name Stray Bullet actually is. Also, they cut away from the gunshot. It's like, what, you couldn't show gore in a Leprechaun movie? More than likely, it was a budget issue and they didn't have time to do the special effects, but come to think of it, there's a lot of kills in this movie that are very basic. The gut explosion was cool, but most of the Leprechaun kills are by hand, and they're super quick, or cuts away very quickly. When you go from the massive amount of creativity of the kills in part 4 to the ones in this one, it's a little bit disappointing. There's also a random scene where the Leprechaun visits Post's blind mother, and because she can't see him, she just assumes she's one of her son's friends and starts feeding the Leprechaun. And in the process, she accidentally pokes out the Leprechaun's eye. The scene just ends here. I guess we're to assume it was a dream that Post was having, but it's not explained very well. And in perhaps a surprising twist, it's Butch that comes up with the plan to stop the Leprechaun, rolling up some 4-leaf clovers inside of a joint. Here, the 4-leaf clovers are supposed to weaken the Leprechaun long enough for them to grab the flute back, but in order to do this, they need to dress up like some of his hoes, meaning there's a lot more cross-dressing in this movie than I would have suspected, but based on the earlier scene, this actually seems to be up the Leprechaun's alley, so it's a much better scheme than you would initially think. They do manage to sneak their way up to the Leprechaun's pad, and after seeing them, the Leprechaun immediately wants head.
Hell no, to the no.
I told you, this is the horniest version of the character, but thankfully, he passes out from the joint before we have to see any of that. On the way out, Butch gets shot by Mac Daddy, R.I.P., and we have a confrontation. Now, judging by the first act of the film, of Mac Daddy wanting things to be violent and Post wanting to make more positive, uplifting music, you would assume that Post would be the better man here and put the gun down, not wanting to succumb to the life of the hood that he is so desperately trying to escape. That he would go on in life and lead a better example for everyone to follow. But you would be wrong, because he shoots the fuck out of Mac Daddy. After that, the ending is very lackluster, as when the Leprechaun returns, the confrontation is super brief. What's left of Mac Daddy, who's barely hanging on, tries to attack him and is killed for good. And as the medallion once again falls from the air, you think the Leprechaun will turn to stone again, but no. It flashes to Post doing a rap song now as a star, but soon we see he's under the Leprechaun's control, meaning the medallion did not land on him this time, making this the first Leprechaun movie where he is undefeated. The Leprechaun finally wins and sings a rap song of his own to celebrate. Damn.
In the hood, I'm the man of green, come to do no good. Left in the hood, come to do no good. I'm a wee green guy who's new to town. Show me what you do when you get down. We're gonna party through the night until the dawn. Then you and I are gonna get it on.
Look, the premise is hilarious. Leprechaun in the hood, why not? And in a series of pure absurdity, I take it for what it is, and there's plenty of enjoyable, funny moments here. But this is not one of my favorites. A lot of the horror stuff is completely gone, with the kill scenes feeling very basic and as simplistic as you could possibly get. It's also disappointing that Ice-T isn't really the main character, because I think his arc would have been far more interesting if he had become this successful millionaire and then had to deal with the consequences of the leprechaun returning firsthand. Instead, he's sort of taken out of most of the movie after the first half hour. Warwick Davis is of course as enjoyable as always, and it's always amusing that somehow the leprechaun can just blend into any environment. To me, it pales in comparison to Leprechaun in Space, but I suppose nothing really reaches that level. But as far as being in the hood goes, it worked out well. Like, really well. E! Online ranked it within the top 10 stoner movies, and in fact it went so well that they didn't even bother to think of another location for the next movie. They just went back to the hood.
I didn't come to play with fruit. I only seek me magic flute.
The title of this movie is a bit misleading, to say the least. Leprechaun Back to the Hood. Well, once again, we are dealing with a completely different story, completely different origin, and completely different powers of the leprechaun. So he's not really going back to the hood at all, because there is no connection between this movie and the previous movie in the hood. And if we even did want to connect them, in the previous movie, the leprechaun survives till the end, still living in the hood. So you didn't really need to go back to it. Also, I'm pretty sure this is not even the same hood as the last movie. And they even tried to trick you in the title, putting a numerical 2 for the word 2, which implies that this is the second film of some kind, when in fact it's not. If anything, it's the 6th film of the Leprechaun franchise, and it would also maybe be the first film since there's no connectivity with the previous 5, but regardless, nobody is going back to anywhere. Perhaps they were just trying to cash in on the Too Fast, Too Furious style of titling your movie, I don't know. Also, there's a very clear spelling error with the word the. They spell it T-H-A. It's weird that nobody noticed that before the posters went out. But one of the original ideas for this movie would have been the leprechaun in Spring Break, which sounds amazing. That was the original treatment written by the director of this film, named Stephen A. Ramlui. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name right, but he brought his idea of Leprechaun in Spring Break to the producers, but apparently the direct-to-video sales for Leprechaun in the Hood were so well received, they just wanted to put him back in the hood again. So Steven rewrote the entire script from scratch, and the studio had their wish fulfilled. This time being distributed by Lionsgate in 2003, Leprechaun Back to the Hood would, for a while, be the last film in the series, and the last to star Warwick Davis in the lead role, which is the most disappointing part of this extremely disappointing movie. They decide to tell a backstory origin for the leprechaun in the prologue, which doesn't really play into anything that happens in the film, so it's kind of pointless. It's about a king that employed a bunch of magical leprechauns to protect his gold, but there was one specific leprechaun who refused to give up the gold once the king was gone, and who also seemed to be the most evil of them all, which starts to throw everything out of whack, because even if we want to believe that all 6 of these original movies take place within the same universe, this origin implies that all of the leprechauns are different, and most of them are not as evil as the main one we follow here, which goes against the theory that every leprechaun looks and acts exactly the same, so I don't know what to believe anymore. I guess you could say all 6 movies take place in different universes, or just Back to the Hood exists within its own tangent pocket universe. At the end of the day, who cares? We're 6 movies into the goddamn Leprechaun franchise. I don't think it matters anymore. Anyway, I guess the intent of this was to give the leprechaun a bit of a redesign. He's not too different, but they wanted to make him look more ancient and, of course, more evil. So his makeup is a little bit more exaggerated, and he has a different clothing set than usual. And overall, I really like this design. Honestly, I think it looks great. It's probably the best thing about the movie. In this film, he goes back to the typical motivation of wanting to get his gold back, but he also has a lot more physicality here. What I mean is, all of his kill scenes are pretty much done by hand. He's more of a vicious little creature than he is a magical one. The only uses of magic that I can find in this movie are with his regenerative abilities whenever he's hurt. Other than that, he doesn't use any magic at all. He doesn't perform any illusions, he doesn't grant any wishes, he doesn't teleport, he doesn't really do anything. But he's certainly strong. He's able to rip people's hearts right out of their bodies, rip their legs off, and he can survive from pretty much anything. And supposedly his weakness is, once again, the 4-leaf clover. And hey, I at least like some kind of consistency here, so I'll give it props for that. In the beginning, he's banished by some priest who's mixed the 4-leaf clover into holy water for some added effect. And then we cut to 1 year later, meeting our main characters, and they are not nearly as entertaining as Post and his crew from the last movie. In fact, I kind of miss that trio a bunch now. Instead, we get much more generic street youth characters that spend a lot of time getting high, dealing drugs, and trying to make ends meet with little money, and the constant threat of rival gang members. It's about as cliche hood as you can get, which I guess is the point of these movies. But we got Emily here, who seems to be the most level-headed, Lisa, her friend, who is the most hot-headed, Jamie, who's the resident goofball stoner of the group and just not as funny as he tries to be, and we have Rory, who is the resident badass of the group and played by Laz Alonso, who would later go on to have a lead role in the TV show The Boys as Mother's Milk. And he is definitely the best actor in this group by far, but his character is so cliche and bland that he still doesn't end up standing out very much. They go to a fortune teller early on who warns them that they will soon come into a lot of wealth, but it won't necessarily be too good for them. Which of course means that during the day out for lunch, Emily crashes through the ground, finding herself in a system of underground tunnels leading her to the Leprechaun's gold. But it takes a little bit for the Leprechaun to appear in this film, unlike some of the other movies, so we actually get some time to see the group gather the gold and start to spend it. They throw some lavish parties and partake in a lot of fun self-care. Our first real scene with the Leprechaun is when he strolls into one of the parties and meets a guy who's smoking it up and decides to join him. Why not?
Yeah, you like that, huh? That's good shit. Good shit, nigga. Yeah, you my nigga, man. I like you. Be stingy on this shit, though.
And honestly, things go pretty great at first. They're just bros being bros. The fun only stops when a piece of gold falls onto the floor and ruins the Leprechaun's buzz. So he kills him with a bong. He also clearly has the munchies now, and he deliriously finds himself shoved into the refrigerator. It's not until the next day at the salon that Emily works at that the characters even begin to realize there's a leprechaun that's after them. The leprechaun waltzes in and decides to give one of the customers a massage with his feet. You ever wanted to know what leprechaun feet look like? And what's even worse is that she's totally into it.
Oh, you got magic in those little hands.
More power to her, and more power to the leprechaun. I mean, we knew the leprechaun was into some freaky stuff because of the last movie, but he's not nearly as freaky in this one. But I can't say there's not a little bit of intimacy going on here with the massage. I don't know. Emily also shoves a razor into his eye, and I swear the leprechaun must get his eye poked out and gouged more than any other horror character. I think this is the 4th time that this has happened in the franchise. The only one of the main cast that's actually killed is Lisa, who finds herself in kind of a legitimate horror stalking scenario as the leprechaun shows up, chases her around her apartment, and eventually stabs her in the gut with his own hand. Once again, he doesn't use any magic in this one, he just tears into people with his claws, and it gets the job done. He also doesn't seem to have as many one-liners. I mean, he does have a few.
What's up, ninjas?
And you know he's in here getting stoned. There's plenty of humor in the movie, but he just seems to be a little more pissed off than usual and not cracking as many jokes, and also, unfortunately, no longer rapping. But now that the other 3 know that there is a leprechaun for real, they debate giving the gold up or maybe trying to keep it. It also looks like the case of gold. Yeah, it's in a case and not in a pot. What's up with that? Kind of lame. Anyways, it looks like the case of gold is endless. It's always replenishing itself. If that's the case, why not just give it back? They already took a bunch out for themselves, so if it's spent, there's no refunding it. The leprechaun soon attacks Emily when she's alone, but Rory is able to run him over with his bike and rescue her for a moment. That's another thing too. The leprechaun gets all kinds of fucked up in this movie. If he's not getting run over by cars, he's just getting shot a lot. I know this is the hood, but damn. He also always regenerates and gets his revenge, like ripping off this girl's jaw to get her gold tooth. It's pretty metal. But I also like when Emily and Rory get picked up by the cops and the Leprechaun faces off against them. By the way, the one black cop is played by Bo Billingsley, which may not mean much to most of you, but to me, this is the guy that voices the character Jet Black from Cowboy Bebop, one of my favorite anime series of all time, so his voice is just iconic to me. It was a pleasant surprise to not only see him in live action, but also see him get killed by a leprechaun.
Oh, it's your gold. Of course, you're a leprechaun.
The white cop tries to square off against the leprechaun and gets his leg ripped off in the process. And to deter the leprechaun for a little while longer, he just gets blasted again, multiple times, and this time by Emily. If there's something this movie is not short on, it's weed and guns, and people trying to fist fight the leprechaun for whatever reason. This part actually reminds me of that scene in Friday the 13th Part 8 where the dude just tries boxing Jason. The gang member just punches the leprechaun over and over again until eventually he gets too winded, and at that point the leprechaun retaliates by ripping his heart out. Oh, and there's nothing I can really comment on about this scene, but the leprechaun picks up one of their phones and starts talking to a chick on the other end. It's pretty great.
About 3'6".
3'6".
Yeah, but I make up for it in other areas, if you know what I mean.
When they regroup at the fortune tellers, it's when they figure out that the four-leaf clover could actually be a weakness to the leprechaun, and guess what? Jamie just happens to have one. You know, I don't want to complain too much because I appreciate any consistency I can get in these movies, but why do characters just always happen to have or find a four-leaf clover instantly? Aren't they supposed to be pretty rare? And yet these characters are always pulling them out of their asses. Yeah, out of their ass and into a bullet. If I were to learn anything about the Hood from these movies, it would be that guns solve most problems. Rory literally laces multiple bullets with ground up four-leaf clovers. I guess that's one way to do it. Jamie tells him that it might not be a good idea because the gun might jam, but when the leprechaun shows up, the gun totally jams. Actually, he does manage to shoot him multiple times first, but it only serves to weaken the leprechaun for a moment. So I assume this means that he needs to unleash the entire four-leaf clover for it to be effective. And not that these movies are connected, but you know what worked as a much better delivery device? A slingshot. One shot, one clover, bam, done. Splitting it up into an entire clip of bullets just seems like a lot of extra steps. Well, Jamie gets stabbed in the leg, and the fortune teller tries to do some weird restraining magic on the leprechaun, but that doesn't work either. It's also one of the only real instances of magic in the movie, and it comes out of nowhere, and then it goes away, and no one ever mentions it again. Now, you would assume that once the final bullets were used, that's when the leprechaun would die, right? I mean, that makes sense. You used the entire clover. Well, you would be wrong. Emily leads the leprechaun to this furnace, tosses him inside, and seemingly seems to incinerate the leprechaun alongside of his gold. Okay, that makes enough sense to me. I could buy that cremating the leprechaun with his gold could kill him, so okay. But nope, he comes back again. Okay, then what will kill him? It has to be the bullets, right? I mean, that's the only thing that they set up here that could possibly take him out. Also, no. So what kills the leprechaun? How about knocking him off a building into a conveniently placed pool of wet cement? Wait, really? Motherfucking wet cement? How does this work? The leprechaun gets about 100 bullets put in him through the course of this movie, along with the four-leaf clover lace bullets, and he comes back just fine. He's incinerated in a furnace, and he comes back just fine. He gets run over with a car, and he comes back just fine. But somehow, wet cement seals the deal. He's strong enough to rip somebody's heart out of their body, but not strong enough to pull himself out of some cement. And even if the cement did have time to harden around him, can't he just break out of it? And if you wanted the leprechaun to turn to stone, why didn't they just put in the amulet that was already used in 2 previous movies? It would make more sense since the amulet itself is magical and could keep him contained, but cement? That's the best they could come up with is cement? This is by far the dumbest ending to any of the Leprechaun movies, and what's even more tragic about it is when you remember that this is the final film with Warwick Davis. This is how Warwick Davis's legacy as the Leprechaun ends. That is just one hard blow to accept. Yeah, I can't help but say this is a huge step down from our first outing in the hood. I kind of miss the struggling rap group, to be honest. I like the design change here and some of the brutality of the kills, but admittedly, the first In the Hood movie was way more fun. The characters were better, and the Leprechaun had more things to do. They tried with this one, but overall, it's the least entertaining movie with Warwick Davis in it. It's odd to not see the Leprechaun use any magic, but he clearly still is magical because of all of his regeneration and his strength, but I can't get over the contrived ending, especially when they set up the whole four-leaf clover thing to begin with and didn't even go with it. But regardless, that's the end of the original series of Leprechaun movies. Leprechaun would not go to the hood for a third time, and in fact, he wouldn't really return at all. For the first time in 10 years, the production of the Leprechaun movies came to a screeching halt. This movie released in 2003, and the next movie with Leprechaun in the title would not come out until 11 years later in 2014. In the meantime, Warwick Davis would go on to be in many other films. He was featured prominently in the Harry Potter movies. He returned to Star Wars. And my personal favorite, other than the Leprechaun, is that he played a guy that likes to throw plates at people in this Texas Chainsaw Massacre ripoff movie called Skin Deep. It's pretty great. Oh, and here's a fun one. Warwick Davis would actually play an entirely different Leprechaun in a kid-friendly movie called A Very Unlucky Leprechaun. It came out in 1998, which was right after the release of Leprechaun 4.
Meet Lucky the Leprechaun. His troubles are catching up with him.
So maybe this is the actual true origin story of the horror Leprechaun. And the funniest thing is that his actions and his mannerisms are pretty much exactly the same. He's just not killing anybody. That's pretty much the only difference.
Now that was a close one. Mind if I pop in? That did bring you luck.
Considering Warwick Davis said in interviews he intended to play the Leprechaun as the same character in all the sequels despite there being no continuity, I'm pretty sure that also applies to this movie as well. Anyway, that does it for the original run of Leprechaun movies. So, sadly, we must say goodbye to the Warwick Davis era of Leprechaun, and soon get ready for the wild world of reboots. And the next one is about as far removed as you could possibly get from the ones we've covered so far. But since this is a natural spot to take a little bit of a detour, I want to take a moment to pause and look into some of the other media outside of the movies involving our favorite little evil leprechaun.
All right, guys, now that we have finished the original run, the first 6 movies in the Leprechaun franchise, and unfortunately, all of the movies featuring Warwick Davis, now that doesn't mean that you should leave the video yet, because there is a lot of great stuff to come. And before we get into the final 2 movies, which, don't worry, I plan to rip Leprechaun Origins apart to the best of my ability. But before we get into that movie and the first time that they tried to really officially reboot the series, even though every movie is a reboot anyway, we're going to step into what I like to call the other media segment and discuss some of the areas where Leprechaun has shown himself outside of the movies. Now, unfortunately, in comparison to a lot of the other horror franchises that I've covered, there's not really a lot here with Leprechaun. In fact, this is the shortest other media segment that I've ever made. And it's unfortunate because I think the Leprechaun deserves his own video game or his own animated series or whatever the case may be, you know. There are a few comic books which are interesting, but it's not as much as the others. You know, the big dogs, Jason, Michael, Freddy, they've all appeared all over the place. You know, they've had different interpretations and they've had other media sources that are also just as entertaining sometimes as the movies, but Leprechaun just never really got the respect. So we're gonna dive into a little bit of that and hang on one sec. Hello?
Hello, Ryan.
Who's this?
Take a wild guess. It's time.
I don't understand.
There's another movie you need to review.
I think you have the wrong number.
You hang up on me and I'll gut you like a fish.
Okay. That was weird. Anyways, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, the other media segment. So we're gonna get into that. And real quick before we do, I would appreciate it if you've enjoyed the video so far, if you've gone on this Leprechaun journey, if you're 3 Guinnesses in, especially, if you guys could do me a gigantic favor right now and just like the video and maybe leave a comment as well. These retrospectives are a ton of fun to make, but they take me about 2.5 to 3 months to do. And in the meantime, it's very, very hard to get a bunch of other videos up on the channel. I try to do my best, but trying to make myself stay afloat here on YouTube is it's difficult. And I'm going on 3 years of doing YouTube full time, and it's still terrifying. And I still don't know what I'm gonna be able to do month to month, you know what I mean? So if any of you guys want to just help me out, I obviously do have a Patreon and channel memberships linked down below. That would be a wondrous support, even $1 a month. Everybody gets the same perk. I'd really appreciate it, but at the very least, a like and a comment would really, really help me out, and I would thank you guys very much. And for your appreciation, beyond just hours and hours of free entertainment for you, I will also do a little Irish jig. But that's only if you like the video. You gotta like it. That's not fair. I can't tell you what to do with your life. You're your own person. All right, you don't want to like it, fine. You don't want to like it, fine. I'll still dance. But just know, I'm only dancing for the people that like the video.
To start off the other media segment, let's talk about some Leprechaun movies that were in the works but never saw the light of day. Now, I did already mention the general concepts for a few where the Leprechaun was taken to other locations such as the White House or Spring Break, both of which I think are incredible missed opportunities, and I think they're worth revisiting in the future if they ever want to. The original Leprechaun in the White House idea would have been during the Clinton administration, which admittedly would have been really funny, but it might even be funnier to see the Leprechaun interact with Trump, so maybe they should get on that. But another idea that never came to fruition was from Warwick Davis himself. He expressed interest in doing a Leprechaun movie where we see the Leprechaun's entire family, and it would be the kind of movie where Warwick Davis himself would play every single member of that family. So it'd be like Eddie Murphy in The Nutty Professor. Imagine an entire dinner table of leprechauns, but they're all Warwick Davis. It mentions that the leprechaun's wife, which I guess would be Warwick Davis dressed as a female leprechaun, so they actually would exist in this continuity, but she would be 10 times more evil than the leprechaun that we already know. Every single piece of this idea would have been hilarious, and it would also lend itself to the theory that every single leprechaun looks exactly the same, male or female. The director of the original film, Mark Jones, who did go on to make a leprechaun-ish style movie with a different mythological creature with Rumpelstiltskin, he did almost come back to the Leprechaun series, but with a twist. And that twist was going to be to turn the leprechaun into a vampire and call it Vamprechaun. So if you've ever wondered if a leprechaun can turn into a vampire at the same time, I guess so. So just imagine Warwick Davis looking exactly the same, except he's wearing a Dracula cape and can probably turn into a bat or something. And apparently this one never happened because he wouldn't have had the specific rights of the Leprechaun series, but he was looking into hiring a lawyer to make sure that he could legitimately make it, and then it turned out there was another twist, that the lawyer was not a real lawyer. And so Mark Jones turned around and sued him instead.
You're not a real lawyer.
But the big ones to mention are, of course, the crossover ideas. A lot of horror versus movie ideas floated around in the early 2000s after the success of Freddy vs. Jason, and every studio was trying to decipher what characters they had the rights to that they could mash together. For an opponent to the Leprechaun, they looked at Candyman, of all things, and these franchises really could not be further apart in tone. The Leprechaun thrives in its absurdity, and Candyman is more of a dark, slow-burning, tragic kind of story. I don't really see them meshing very well. Seeing these two characters interact would be nothing short of strange, but maybe there's a writer out there somewhere that could somehow pull it all together and make it make sense. However, when the idea was presented to Tony Todd, the actor that plays Candyman himself, it was immediately shot down. He was quoted saying that it did come across his desk and that he saw it and said, "I will never be involved in something like that." I respect the character, and once a horror character becomes something of an icon like Candyman, reluctantly or not, you have to treat that with respect. So basically, he had so much respect for the character that he didn't want it to stoop as low as battling it out with the Leprechaun, and that's probably for the better. Although I do love Freddy vs. Jason, that doesn't mean that a versus film would work well with just two random characters thrown at each other. There was also some rumblings of a Leprechaun versus Wishmaster idea that floated around thanks to a pretty famous fan-made trailer back in the day, but not too much info exists on whether or not this was legitimately being considered. And of course, a lot of fans online expressed interest in seeing a Leprechaun versus Chucky movie because, well, they're both short. But no, I could see a little bit of validity here. I mean, voodoo and magic are staples of the Chucky franchise, and I can't say that it wouldn't be entertaining as hell to see the charismatic banter back and forth between Warwick Davis and Brad Dourif. But these characters are owned by different studios, and striking a deal like that would be virtually impossible to make everybody happy. Especially now, since Chucky is at least more popular and more mainstream than Leprechaun, and it seems like its creator, Don Mancini, has a large amount of control over that world and those characters, and whatever plans he has for Chucky moving forward probably does not involve a visit from the Leprechaun. But what would be funny, though, is if you took the idea of there being multiple Leprechauns, like the sequels imply, and that they all look like Warwick Davis, versus the multiple Chucky dolls that have appeared in Cult of Chucky and the TV series. Yeah, so it would just be an army of Leprechauns versus an army of Chuckies. There was also a movie pitch from Darren Lynn Boundsman, who is the director of a handful of the Saw sequels, who wanted to take the Leprechaun back to the Old West during the Colorado Gold Rush. I heard some rumblings that he was thinking about doing this with the Leprechaun going into a time machine, which is a little bit weird because it's a leprechaun. You can have it exist wherever you want to. They're basically immortal. But essentially, the main idea was Leprechaun goes west. And hey, why not? Stick that right up there with the White House and Spring Break idea and keep them all coming. When it comes to books on the Leprechaun, I could not find any specific novelizations of the films, but I did find the existence of a novel that's called Leprechaun in the Hood, the Musical, a Novel, by Cameron Pierce, Adam Caesar, and Shane McKenzie, which is a completely original story about characters making a musical about Leprechaun in the Hood, and in the process of making that musical, a real leprechaun shows up that they have to fight against. So it's a meta making of a movie, turning a movie into a musical, but it's a novel, but a real leprechaun shows up in the novel. I have no idea, but it's got some pretty good reviews. When it comes to comic books, the Leprechaun has shown up a few times, but I find it really difficult to get information on them. From what I can tell, there was a 4-issue series from Lionsgate, as well as a 1-issue backstory of O'Grady getting the gold before the original film begins. But the most interesting thing about Leprechaun appearing in comics is where we get the name Lubden. So some people might have heard the Leprechaun's name referenced online as being Lubden, but I haven't brought it up or used it in this video so far because Lubden is never mentioned in any of the movies, and it in fact comes from the 4-issue Lionsgate comic book series. The original creator, Mark Jones, has stated that in the original draft for the first Leprechaun movie, he stated the name to be Basil, but it was removed from the actual film. Then later on, Lubden came from the comic series. So depending on what you want to consider canon, Leprechaun is named Basil or Lubden, or for me, I prefer to just think of him not having a name at all. He's just a leprechaun. I see no reason to call him Lubden or give him some kind of name other than it just being a term that's floated around on the internet for a while. The original creator did not plan on that being his name, and if you go by the movies themselves, which is what I prefer to do, he is never once called or referred to as Lubden, only as a leprechaun. The only time Lubden comes up specifically is in the comic. And speaking of that comic, it makes no goddamn sense. And sure, that's coming from a franchise as wild as the Leprechaun series, but the comic takes it in a completely different direction, and taking the Leprechaun's name to be canon from this version would be quite the stretch. Here, Lubden is the last surviving leprechaun from an all-out war between leprechauns and another mythological race called the Leprechaun. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it also comes from Irish folklore. Here in the comic, the leprechaun is like some medieval warrior. He wields a sword, and he doesn't talk in rhymes, and he doesn't even seem to be that evil in the slightest. In fact, in the story, Lubden teams up with two human nerds that help him hunt down his gold coins, while also being attacked by various Leprechaun warriors and wizards along the way. He fights hordes of villains in hand-to-hand combat, acting way more like a dwarf barbarian from Dungeons & Dragons than anything leprechaun-related. And the fact that he's totally cool with just teaming up with human characters that can't even fight are just bizarre. I mean, it does have him looking for gold in the comics, so that's the closest thing you get to relation to the movies, but it's more like an adventure quest than it is some kind of slasher takedown. This is honestly weirder than the leprechaun going to space or rapping in the hood. The fact that people get the leprechaun's name Lubden from this comic series is even more bizarre because other than Leprechaun Origins, this comic is by far the farthest removed from the traditional character. But besides that, delving into even further media, unfortunately, there's not a lot. There's currently no adaptation of the Leprechaun in any video games, nor can I find any music that's specifically based on the Leprechaun franchise, which means Ice Nine Kills need to get their shit together and talk about Leprechaun on the next Silver Scream album. Now, Warwick Davis has donned the makeup a couple of times, showing up on TV back in the 90s.
Oh, where did you come from? Oh, never mind.
And he also mentions the Leprechaun specifically within his autobiography.
Have you seen a Leprechaun movie? Oh, you poor bugger. Back to the hood. In that film, I smoked a bong that was as big as me.
Now, you may think there was no movies that ripped off the Leprechaun, but you would be wrong. Would you actually believe that there is another horror Leprechaun movie series? The Leprechaun's Game from 2020 and The Leprechaun's Curse from 2021. These are even more low budget and terrible than anything from the proper Leprechaun series. Their Leprechaun looks like Howard Stern jacked up on meth. I have no words for how abysmal these are, and the fact that there's two of them blows my mind even further. They have the same general premise of a leprechaun wanting to get his gold back from a group of people who took it and kills them one by one, but here he uses regular weapons most of the time. And he's also not even played by a little person, but just a regular-sized guy in a mask. I would actually rather rewatch Leprechaun Origins than sit through either of these. But if you happen to like them for some god-awful reason, the director, Louisa Warren, has also made about 33 of these direct-to-DVD low-budget horror films based on various mythological creatures, like the Tooth Fairy, Scarecrow series, Jack and Jill. Yeah, not that Jack and Jill, but a different Jack and Jill. So if you're really thriving for this kind of content, there's no shortage of it. Go check out her IMDb page and have at it. And when you watch these movies, just know you're a much braver soul than I am. I am also unable to find any specific fan-made Leprechaun films, and thank God no porn parodies that I'm aware of. But it also means that this other media segment is going to be quite shorter than the other ones I made for previous retrospective videos. Of course, there is an irony there since the Leprechaun himself is very short, but I also think it's kind of a bummer because this has always been one of my favorite segments, and I don't really have a lot to include here. But the truth is, the Leprechaun franchise was never really big or expansive enough to spread its wings into other media. I mean, only 2 of these films ever went to theaters, so extending its reach into other formats never really was a huge incentive for the studios. Maybe someday we'll get a Leprechaun video game, or maybe at least more comic books that make a little bit more sense. But until then, let's step back into the world of the movies and finish this retrospective out properly.
Alright, welcome back everybody. I know that was a short little break, but we're going to dive right into the final 2 movies, which essentially we have Leprechaun Origins, which is a complete tonal shift reboot of the series that they attempted to do, and then after that catastrophe, they went back and made Leprechaun Returns, which, like I said, is the only official sequel connecting directly to the original. So we're going to get into that, and hang on. Yes, hello?
You're on the wrong movie.
I still think you have the wrong number, brah.
There's no more waiting. Review it.
What? What? No. You're gonna make me review something?
You're damn right I am.
No, I don't.
You've avoided it for too long.
I don't want to.
You can't escape.
I don't want to.
So after a long 11-year gap from 2003 to 2014, there would finally be another Leprechaun movie, or at least a movie with Leprechaun in the title. And the thing that brought Leprechaun out of its long retirement was the WWE. Yeah, the World Wrestling Entertainment, the very same. In the early 2000s, WWE added an extra entertainment branch that would begin to develop and create its own movies, simply titled WWE Films, beginning with giving The Rock his first leading role in the movie The Scorpion King, and when it was starting off, that's essentially what the studio did. It was meant as a jumping off point for its wrestlers to begin starring in movies. They put Kane in a horror film called See No Evil, they put John Cena in The Marine, they put Triple H in The Chaperone? Anyway, the point is, this was a vessel for WWE stars to stretch their acting wings and get a guaranteed lead role in a movie. They would then team up with a larger studio for distribution rights. Lionsgate had already been the distributor for See No Evil, and Lionsgate also had the rights to Leprechaun. And the WWE had, Hornswoggle. So I'll be honest, although I did watch WWE as a kid, although back then it was WWF, I never kept up with it, and I have no idea who Hornswoggle is. But sometime in the mid-2000s, he joined the WWE, and he had matches where he periodically dressed up as a leprechaun in the ring. He also apparently really wanted to play the Leprechaun in a movie. So WWE did the same thing it did with its previous wrestling stars and struck a deal to make a brand new Leprechaun movie where Hornswoggle, his real name is Dylan Postal, would play the iconic character. And I suppose that did happen, although you would never know it. Yeah, I'm going to cut through the suspense and just show you the Leprechaun in this movie. The film itself tries to keep you in suspense about what it looks like, and you barely see it shrouded in darkness. You hardly ever get a clear look at it in the film itself. But if you imagine anything like the Warwick Davis Leprechaun, or hell, even just any kind of general understanding of what leprechauns should look like, you would be wrong. Are you ready for the Leprechaun in this movie? Okay. This is the Leprechaun in Leprechaun Origins. And no, this is not an image of the creatures from the movie The Descent, although it may as well be, because it essentially looks and acts exactly the same as well. If you're just as curious as me about what the shit this is even supposed to be, well, let's talk about it. Leprechaun Origins is, of course, a reboot, not connected in any way to the previous 6 movies, and at this point, that's no shocker anyway, since none of those movies are really connected except for the fact they star Warwick Davis. But Origins decides to not just reboot, but also stray as far as physically possible from the original series. This movie is trying and failing radiantly at being a legitimate horror movie. They take it extremely seriously and have its main characters hunted down by a deformed monstrosity in the countryside of Ireland. With that, everything you know and love about the Leprechaun movies are gone. The Warwick Davis Leprechaun looks like a traditional description of what you would think the creature is, minus his skin and claws. But this leprechaun doesn't even wear clothes and is just a gray monstrous blob, like I said, looking exactly like the creatures from The Descent. The Warwick Davis leprechaun speaks, he cracks jokes, and he laughs maniacally, relishing every single kill that he gets. The leprechaun in this movie cannot speak and just growls and roars without any kind of personality. The Warwick Davis leprechaun normally utilizes magic to attack his victims, and this leprechaun is just a monster. It just uses its teeth and its claws to eat people. In fact, looking at this thing, you wouldn't even know that a little person plays the creature. It looks just like an average-sized dude that's hunched over in a costume. Hornswoggle, who is credited as the creature, he doesn't even get to act, he doesn't get to speak, he doesn't have any memorable moments or lines, he's barely seen beyond a few glimpses in the costume, and is completely disposable, as in anybody could have put on the suit at any time. If you didn't know he was in this movie, you never would know. So why go through the effort to give one of your wrestling stars his own movie if you don't even get to see him in the movie? The Leprechaun would be a great vessel for a new star to make it their own with all of his charisma and dialogue, but instead, he's just the epitome of a generic monster. I guess maybe in an attempt to not step on the shoes of Warwick Davis, they just went in a completely opposite direction, but this is the major problem with a lot of these horror remakes, is that we as fans come here because we love the characters, and that's the draw. It's not just the title of the franchise. I understand it's easier to reboot a character like Michael Myers since it relies more on body language and he's behind a mask and doesn't speak. But when you try to remake Chucky and you make him a boring AI robot without the personality and performance of Brad Dourif, or when you reboot Freddy Krueger, making him a bland, deep-voiced, generic villain instead of the full embracement of the character that Robert Englund had, they all fall flat on their ass. But even those two examples were at least a little closer than what the Leprechaun gets. This isn't even Leprechaun at all. It's a monster from The Descent, and you may as well have just swapped it out for any other kind of creature. To direct this movie, they got a guy named Zach Lipovsky, and he made a live-action Dead Rising movie based on the video game. I had no idea that even existed. He also directed a live-action Kim Possible movie with Adam Stein, and those two directors together are also directing the upcoming Final Destination Bloodlines. Dear God, you know, I'm making this video before that movie comes out, and I really wanted it to be good. I've been waiting for another good Final Destination movie, and all I have to go on for these directors is Leprechaun Origins, and I know it might be shocking, but I never watched the Kim Possible live action. Anyway, I just hope Final Destination Bloodlines is way better than what this movie turns out to be. The opening of the movie shows random characters running in long grass from some kind of monster, which reminds me of a scene from a different movie. The real main characters are 4 American college students traveling in Ireland, and I guess if any credit was due, this is the only Leprechaun movie to fully take place in Ireland. I know the bar is low, but I'm really trying to think of some positives here. Also, one of the students is played by Brendan Fletcher, who I'll always remember most from Freddy vs. Jason. Freddy vs. Jason. Now that's a good movie. You guys want to talk about Freddy vs. Jason instead? Technically, I've already talked about it in 2 different retrospectives, but honestly, I'd rather talk about it a third time than talk about Leprechaun Origins. And by the way, Origins? What does that even mean? This movie has nothing to do with any kind of origin. The Leprechaun already exists in this movie and has for some time. This was just a random subtitle to throw on the film when they didn't know what else to call it. It's kind of like the word resurrection. You just slap that on a movie, it doesn't need to have any kind of meaning. Anyway, all the characters here suck, unsurprisingly. They have no defining personalities. I just watched the movie and I couldn't tell you a damn thing about them other than they're history majors, and that's why they're in Ireland. They're told by an older Irishman at a tavern that they should check out these old caverns in the countryside and that he would take them out there to a cabin that they can stay at on the way. Already a terrible idea, but they go along with it. Even stupider is that when they get to the cabin, the old man literally has to shoot something in the grass that's coming towards them, and yet somehow the kids still don't take this as a sign to leave this very bad place.
What was that? What was that all about?
There's a lot of wild boars around these parts.
Well, no surprise is that in the middle of the night, the creature begins to stalk them, and like I said, you barely get any clear look at the leprechaun. There's also no attempts to be tongue-in-cheek or self-aware here. They're actually trying to make it a pure horror film, and as much as I love horror, when you're doing it with something like Leprechaun, I think it's a bad move because that makes it so that there's no enjoyable aspect here. You can't have any fun with the concept. You could call this movie something else and it wouldn't make any difference. And the Leprechaun also has predator heat vision for some reason. I don't know why. I guess relating to leprechauns a little, it does rip off one of the character's gold earrings, so there's that. Mostly anything that relates to leprechaun lore, though, comes when the characters hide out in the basement, and they conveniently come across all of the information that they need to know, just right there laid out on the table. It's like, hey, I found the exposition book right here. It tells them that nearby villagers found gold in the caverns belonging to the leprechaun creature, and to make sure that the leprechaun doesn't come after them, they need to give it human sacrifices on a yearly basis. How they decided to make a deal with the creature that only communicates and growls and grumbles is beyond me, but that's why the kids were brought here. It's all about human sacrifice. Another thing that really sucks about this movie, beyond the characters and the leprechaun itself, is the way that it's filmed. It's one of those movies where everything is incredibly dark, making it hard to make out anything that's happening. As well, its editing continuously cuts like every 1.5 seconds. The camera never sticks in one spot long enough to get a sense of space or direction or any of the action. All of the horror stuff is murky, quick-cut editing, along with the constant use of some kind of strange blur effect that lasts the entire movie. Yeah, they make the dark, murky-looking cinematography even worse by turning on and off a blur effect, and it feels so random, like a monkey is fiddling with a dial between blurry and not blurry. It is just simply terrible to look at. Anyway, after a bunch of repetitive chase scenes, the group of four are caught by the old Irishman and his group of people. They tie the kids up to trees to be sacrificed for good, and instead of the leprechaun just coming in and killing them, it takes all the time in the world to stand there growling and sniffing menacingly. Eventually, the only character I kinda liked because I recognize the actor gets his stomach cut open and also conveniently undoes the rope in the process, and instead of his guts falling out onto the ground, he has enough energy to grab a machete and cut everybody else loose before he dies. Wonderful. Okay, so I will give the movie one more compliment. When they get back to the cabin, they grab some weapons, and there's a moment where the leprechaun grabs Jenny and shoves her in front of the other two out of his tunnel. They instantly think it's the leprechaun popping out and decide to attack, slicing her face in half with an axe. The whole scene is played serious, but intentional or not, this was a great dark comedy moment for me, and I definitely laughed. Guy Ben is eventually attacked as well, in a decent way, getting his spine ripped out, but a couple of seconds of a cool kill is not enough to save the entire movie. It leads up to the eventual final chase scene with our final girl, and there's also a subplot of the old Irishman's son, Sean, who grows a conscience throughout the film and no longer wants to go along with the sacrifice idea. So he turns on his dad, lets Sophie escape, and so he reluctantly watches the leprechaun kill his dad, knowing it'll probably come after him next. It's the closest you'll get to any kind of character development here. The finale is just as bogus as the rest of the movie. Sophie makes it to the tall grass like we saw in the beginning, and when cornered by the leprechaun, she says this.
Fuck you, Lucky Charms.
One of my biggest pet peeves in movies is using an iconic line from a previous film. Sometimes it can work, but normally it comes off completely corny and out of place. But in a movie like this that took itself so seriously the entire time and had virtually no connection to the comedy aspects of the franchise or any of the other Leprechaun movies, now out of nowhere, she's just gonna say a goofy line from the original. It makes no sense. It made a little bit more sense in the original, both because it's a silly movie to begin with, and it's a little kid saying it. To imagine the only survivor that just watched her friends get slaughtered and hasn't spoken in any kind of pun or catchphrases the entire movie would now all of the sudden say this one-liner in her most dire moment? You gotta be kidding me. Also, she kills the leprechaun by chopping off his head. Once again, you gotta be kidding me. That's all it takes to kill it? A powerful mythological creature that you need to give human sacrifices to, and you can just kill it in a conventional way? You don't need a 4-leaf clover, you don't need wrought iron, you don't need a magic amulet, you just cut its fucking head off. What the hell? Anybody could have done this. Why has nobody done it before? I guess the only workaround for this is that in the final shot, you see the grass moving in multiple locations, implying that there were actual multiple leprechauns the entire time. They also can't move past their territory, so when Sophie makes it to the rock formation, she's home free anyway. But ultimately, this movie is such a mess. Leprechaun Origins takes everything fun and enjoyable about the series and throws it out the window without offering anything interesting in return. In a movie that's about making sacrifices, they sacrificed anything that you like about the Leprechaun movies and replaced it with a bland, generic monster movie that is a pain to sit through and offers you arguably one good kill scene, which isn't even done by the Leprechaun himself. I feel bad for Hornswoggle because there's no indication he's even in this movie, or that a little person even played the Leprechaun. The acting is poor across the board, and between the way this movie is lit and edited, and with the continuous blur effects and strange predator vision POV shots, you can't even make sense of what's happening half the time. It's not just bad, it's practically unwatchable. And at this point, I would do anything to go back to the hood for a third time. The film was, of course, a direct-to-video and streaming movie and was understandably poorly received across the board. If anything, I guess you could say that this was a failed experiment, and it's certainly the black sheep of the franchise. A one and done, with no sequels or continuations in this new universe, and that's for the best. Let's just say that it happened, and then move on with the rest of our lives. Shockingly, though, it did not completely kill the franchise. Only 4 years later, in 2018, we would get another, and as of the recording of this video, the final Leprechaun movie. And with this one, we're taking it back to the true origins, connecting directly to the original film.
Fuck you, Lucky Charms!
No, I told you, I'm not interested. I don't want to do it. I have to talk about Leprechaun Returns right now, and this is not what I need.
What you need is to talk about the franchise you've been avoiding.
You think I want to get involved in the Scream fandom? Have you seen the online community, man? Everyone's always arguing with each other constantly. There's like this division between the new fans and the old school fans, and nobody can agree on anything. Look, I love Wes Craven, and I love those original Scream movies, but getting involved with that fandom at this point in 2025... Are you sure, man?
This is about a hell of a lot more than Scream.
Wait.
Yes.
You're not talking about Scream.
Oh no. I am talking about a means to summon the worst of horror. Also look to your right.
So not long after the disaster of Leprechaun Origins, there came a movie called Halloween. Not Halloween, and also not Halloween, but Halloween. In the fandom, we just call it Halloween 2018. It served as a direct sequel to the original 1978 Halloween, ignoring all of the other sequels and timelines, of which there is way more than you would expect for a slasher series. And with that, it tossed out years of established lore and characters, and in return gave us a joke like this.
Oh, man. I got peanut butter on my penis.
But I'm just picking. Even though I have my issues with Halloween 2018, it was filmed incredibly well with respect to the John Carpenter original. It had a pretty great Michael Myers interpretation and with a newly revamped John Carpenter score. It was also very well received at the time, and it got hyped up for getting Jamie Lee Curtis back into the franchise once again. Now, I'm not saying that Halloween 2018 is the sole inspiration for Leprechaun Returns. They actually came out only 2 months apart, which means they'd have to be in production at least around the same time. But what was happening in the horror genre was a trend beginning to form, where they created a new sequel but connected it only to the original. They did it with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Candyman, and even kinda with Scream, even though that does include the previous sequels, but it was sort of like a newer reboot, with our well-known established characters passing the mantle to younger characters. If horror works in trends, then Leprechaun was no exception. The only thing that makes Leprechaun significantly different is that, unlike other franchises, Leprechaun has never had a legitimate sequel. As we've discussed this entire video, none of the movies are connected at all. Leprechaun Returns from 2018 is the only movie in the whole series that has a specific connection with a previous film, and that's the 1993 original. The rights got shifted over to various production companies parented by the Sci-Fi Channel, of all places. Yes, the source of those 10,000 different killer shark direct-to-video movies had now acquired the Leprechaun, almost fitting in a way. And they went ahead with their legacy sequel idea of Leprechaun Returns. It's directed by Steven Kostanski, who was one of the 2 directors that worked on the movie The Void. But there are 2 gigantic bummers with this idea. The first is that even though the Leprechaun character would be the same as the original, Warwick Davis did not return to the role, which right there really feels like it kind of defeats the purpose. Apparently, he was asked to be in the movie, but he made the personal decision to step away from the horror genre. He stated, "We did 6 Leprechaun films, and around Halloween, people always watch them and love them. Horror is an interesting medium, and I think it's different when you have kids. You look at horror in a slightly different way. Since I finished the Leprechaun films, I had kids, and I see the world through their eyes, and to be in a horror movie right now is probably not quite right. I will wait until my son turns 18, and then I'll do some horror again." And I can't say that I fully understand or agree with his sentiments here, and maybe this was just a press-friendly way of saying that he's over doing the Leprechaun, but whatever the case, he chose of his own accord not to come back. So the character had to be recast, and we got Lyndon Porco in the role. And here's the thing, he's fine. He does his best trying to recreate and imitate Davis's performance. I don't think he completely succeeds, but it could have been a lot worse. Maybe after Origins, I'm just happy to have anything that resembles the character that we know, and obviously he doesn't have the same magnetic charm that Warwick Davis had, but for the time that he's on screen, I think it's serviceable enough, and he kind of makes it his own by the end. The other major bummer is that Jennifer Aniston does not return as Tori, and I know, there's no way in hell that she would come back for a Sci-Fi Channel original movie of a Leprechaun sequel 25 years later after she's become a huge success, but that's why it sucks. Why not? Did they even bother to ask her, I wonder? I have no idea. What has she got to lose at this point? She's already a multimillionaire. Instead, we have Lila, who is supposed to be Tori's daughter, and we find out through passing dialogue that Tori is dead from cancer. Really? Really, we had to kill her off screen and we couldn't just make up a reason for her absence? We couldn't just say like, hey, she doesn't live in the town that the movie takes place in? I don't know. One of my biggest pet peeves in movies is killing characters off screen in between movies. I'm looking at you, Alien 3. But that's the explanation they give us. Tori is dead, and Lila's last name is also Jenkins, so I guess that means that Tori never married Nathan either. So if you happen to ship these two, it didn't happen. However, we do have one returning character from the original, and it's Ozzy. Yes, Mark Holton is back, still living in the same town as the events of the first movie. But there is no mention of where Nathan or Alex is. Would have been interesting to see Alex as an adult and what he was like now, but at least we have Ozzy. The movie begins with an odd, exaggerated retelling of the ending of the original, with our new actor as the Leprechaun falling down a well almost like it's his own personal nightmare. But twist, it's not his nightmare, it's Lila's nightmare. Even though she's never met the Leprechaun, her mom told her all about the traumatic events, but of course, she was probably just delusional. May as well make a trip to the same location all of her horrors stem from to try to get together with a group of other college kids and fix up the old farmhouse into a sorority house. What could go wrong? A sorority house idea is kind of strange because isn't this supposed to be a pretty small town with this house specifically out on its own, far away from it all? What college would even possibly be nearby? She also conveniently gets a ride from Ozzy, and it's not long until the topic is brought up that he realizes this is Tori's daughter. Now, Ozzy's characterization here is interesting because in the original, it was stressed how simple-minded and superstitious he was, but now he's older and you get a sense that he's a little bit wiser than before, but still maintains an optimistic look on things. He gives Lila a warning to steer clear of the well, and if she feels that she's in danger, to go into the basement for something. And that's kind of an ominous, weird warning to get from a random stranger that you just met that claims that he knows your mom. But for us as the audience, if you know Ozzy, this moment is kind of wholesome. But from Lila's perspective, that could be incredibly creepy. Basically, Lila and the other girls there are fixing the place up to be a super eco-friendly kind of sorority house. Solar panels on the roof, self-contained water systems. I don't know, I just assume this is what all girls do when they have fun together. I have yet to figure out if the eco-friendly stuff was intended to be some kind of theme in the movie, but that might be trying to give the movie way too much credit. There's also a guy that shows up that records everything, wanting to be a filmmaker, and he just constantly drops random directors' names, and I think this is supposed to be a satire on your average college film bro.
See, visually, I was going for like a David Lean thing here, making the landscape the protagonist.
Anyway, let's talk about the Leprechaun. So I mentioned how one of the benefits of not connecting to the other movies is that they never had to explain how the Leprechaun came back after being defeated at the end of the previous one. Well, here we finally get our first example of that. Ozzy leaves his phone behind, and when he comes back to get it, he gets too close to the well, and green water splashes up, hitting him in the face, and he accidentally swallows some of it, causing the Leprechaun to, I guess, manifest inside of his stomach and burst out of it like an alien. But the wildest and most unexpected piece of continuity here is that while bursting out of his stomach, the Leprechaun retrieves his gold coin. Yeah, the one that Ozzy swallowed 25 years ago. So you're telling me that a gold coin has just been sitting in his stomach this entire time? Too bad it's not the Leprechaun 3 rules and Ozzy could have been granting wishes to himself this entire time. And if I want to make sense of this, it is stated in the original that the Leprechaun's powers are connected to his gold, so if Ozzy had gold in his stomach and got too close to the well, I guess it was enough to revive the Leprechaun. But sadly, that means Ozzy is dead, meaning we have to say goodbye to our only real connection to the first, and now we have to deal with a bunch of super annoying college kid characters the rest of the film. So what do you think the Leprechaun wants to do now that he's revived? I'll give you 3 guesses. Either A, get his gold back, B, get his gold back, or C, kill the mailman. If you pick C, you're correct. And I do like the little detail of him cleaning his shoes afterwards, which is something that hasn't really been brought up in a while. And after that, he goes to find his gold. He comes face to face with Lila, at which point she suddenly realizes that everything her mom said to her was true. And I also got to give them credit for bringing back iron as a weakness for the Leprechaun as well from part 2. Again, this continuity has nothing to do with part 2, but whatever, it's something other than the 4-leaf clover to bring up. Obviously, Lila isn't able to convince the others just yet that there's a killer leprechaun on the loose, but the rest of the movie plays out like your typical slasher, which I think is kind of great. I think the biggest issue with the first Leprechaun movie is that there's barely a body count, but here, there's lots of kids to kill off, and in some pretty creative ways, like dropping one of the solar panels to split a guy in half. There's also a lot of references to other horror movies. There's obviously the chestburster moment, but there's also the scene where the Leprechaun rips the skin off his face, revealing a screaming skull, which is the same thing that Freddy Krueger does in the first Nightmare on Elm Street. There's a scene where he turns himself into a bunch of mini leprechauns, reminiscent of the scene in Army of Darkness. And I also like when the girl calls him a troll.
You vile troll! Troll? That's just offensive.
He says it's offensive, which makes me wonder, is troll like a slur to leprechauns? Or do trolls actually exist and he doesn't want to be compared to them? Is the girl being racist to leprechauns, or is the leprechaun being racist to trolls? I'll never know. And there's a lot of great funny moments too, like when they run and get into the car and the leprechaun's already in there.
We should get out of here. He's probably really close by now.
My only gripe after this point is that the movie is incredibly dark. Pretty much it all takes place at night and it's lit so dimly. Most of the original movie is also at night, but you could see everything. And I feel like this is more of a gripe with modern movies than it is with this film in particular. It's like we forgot how to light night scenes. But Lila finally remembers the warning that Ozzy gave her, and she goes into the basement to find a Ghost Ozzy. I guess that's a new addition to the lore, who apparently can't speak in his ghost form and can only communicate in a game of charades. He directs her to all of the information that they've collected on leprechauns, including its powers and weaknesses, and armed with the information, she goes off to face it. There's also a moment where the leprechaun flies a drone into a tree. And then it has to replace its eyeball once again. Probably the only consistent running gag in all of these movies. And this time he uses Ozzy's eyeball to do it. He then kills another girl using the sprinkler system, and it's pretty great. And although they try to use the drone to spy on him, Leprechaun takes control of it and kills the film bro with it.
Audiences love lots of gore.
With the final 3 survivors, one of the girls reveals that they can't give the leprechaun back all of his gold because it was actually already found and spent on the eco-friendly renovations to the house. Again, too bad this movie doesn't take place in the same world as Leprechaun Back to the Hood, because the gold would just replenish itself, but who can keep track of all these ever-changing rules? They decide to give him back what they do have of the gold, and to try to make the pot feel like it's filled up to the top, they fill the extra space with tampons. And after that, they pelt the leprechaun with pillows. Tampons and pillow fights. This really is a girls' night. But it's all just a distraction to trap him in a circle of iron while they come up with their real plan. Leprechaun alters his voice to try to sound like Lila's mom, Tori, and I gotta say, the Jennifer Aniston impression is spot on.
I told you, all of this is real. You have to believe me.
I actually held out the slightest of hope that they actually got her to record the lines, but they didn't. It's somebody else. They mix together clover juice, I guess, that they just happen to have, and in an attempt to make him explode, which also reminds me of the ending of Child's Play 2. But it must not have been 4-leaf clovers, because he's able to regenerate himself into a bunch of tiny bits, throwing hammers,
Hammer time.
and making her trip into the trophy. So the 2 remaining girls just say, fuck it to its weaknesses, and they just use the gold as a conductor to blow up the house. Which is basically the same ending to Halloween 2018, but in the Leprechaun movie, we get a happy Ozzy Force Ghost at the end, so point goes to Leprechaun there. At the very end, we see the Leprechaun one last time, fully reformed, because, duh, he can regenerate, and he hitches a ride with a chicken truck wanting to go back to Bismarck, which is in North Dakota where the movie takes place, so assumingly he's gonna try to continue to chase after Lila and get the rest of his gold, which she wouldn't have since it was blown up with him, so maybe he just wants revenge instead. Whatever the case, this is the state that we leave our Leprechaun in, and as of the recording of this is the final Leprechaun movie. I'll say this, Leprechaun Returns is better than I expected it to be. It didn't need to be a sequel to the original. You could have just had this whole basic story play out of the sorority girls fixing up an eco-friendly house as a leprechaun attacks them, but the fact that they tried to connect it to the original and gave us Ozzy back, I do appreciate, since no other Leprechaun film ever tried to bother with this approach. I do miss Warwick Davis a lot in the role, and it sucks that he's not here, but Lyndon Porco does a fine job in his place, serviceable at the very least. And you know what? The kills are great. If you just want some classic slasher carnage, you get it here. The gore is leveled up from a lot of the sequels, and they get pretty creative with it too, so I can't complain too much there. All in all, with what we have and on a Sci-Fi Channel budget, it's honestly pretty alright. Yeah. But yes, as of right now, that was the last Leprechaun movie, so what is the future of this franchise, if it even has one? Well, let's get into that, but first, now that we've completed all of the reviews, I want to count down my personal top 10 kills of the Leprechaun franchise. Alright, my top 10 kills of the Leprechaun franchise. What I like about this series is that there's a lot of variety to the kills. There's magical kills, there's just intense, brutal physical kills, comedy kills, it just goes all over the place. And so my list is also kind of all over the place. But we'll start with number 10, which is very simple, but something that I always like seeing. It is the kill from Leprechaun Back to the Hood, where he just reaches into a man's chest and pulls his heart out. Now, we've seen other horror characters do this. We've seen Jason do this, but there's something about seeing the Leprechaun, this little, like, 3-foot tall, bizarre creature just reach his hand up and pull somebody's still beating heart out of their chest. Sometimes the simplest kills are the most fun, which is why I'm also going to go with my number 9, which might seem very basic, but I think it's the novelty of watching the Leprechaun do it. And that is at the end of Leprechaun 3, where he cuts the magician in half with a chainsaw. There's just something about the imagery of seeing Leprechaun with a chainsaw that I really, really enjoy, and I have to put it here. Now, some people might call out the lightsaber kill from Leprechaun 4 in space, which the kill itself is not that great. It's off screen. All you really do is see him swinging the lightsaber. So that one is actually not on my list. Maybe it's an honorable mention just for the implement that he uses to do it, but you don't really get to see the lightsaber kill that well. So that one's not going to be on the list, unfortunately. But what is going to be on the list are a couple of kills from Leprechaun Returns. Now, like I said, I don't think this movie is that bad. It's not amazing either, but we are talking about the Leprechaun franchise here. But the one thing that Leprechaun Returns does very well, in my opinion, are the kill scenes. And really, it's a step up from a lot of the other movies, in my opinion, regardless of what you think of the overall movie, the overall story, the overall characters. If you're just looking at the kill scenes, Leprechaun Returns has quite a few great ones to choose from. But at my number 8, I'm going to pick the scene where the one girl is battling with all the mini leprechauns and she trips and falls on the trophy that just goes right through her face. For my number 7 pick, we're going to go all the way back to Leprechaun 2, and this is, of course, when Morty tries to get one up on the Leprechaun and have it grant his wishes, and he wishes for his pot of gold, but he never said where the pot of gold should show up, and Leprechaun just decides to manifest it inside of his stomach. My number 6 kill is also going to be from Leprechaun 2, and this is when the Leprechaun creates the fabrication of the character of Bridget, taking off all of her clothes in the garage, leading the character to her, but really, instead of just going towards those bazongas to grab them, he's actually going towards 2 lawnmower blades that are spinning as fast as possible and end up chopping them into pieces. For my number 5 favorite kill, we're going back to Leprechaun Returns, and this is going to be the sprinkler kill. This is a great moment where Leprechaun promises not to lay a hand on her, but that doesn't mean he can't use magic, and he causes the sprinkler to fly up into her mouth, and I love the little gag of seeing like the blood coming out through the sprinkler. Just a funny little moment that I really enjoy. For my number 4 favorite pick, we're gonna go to the original Leprechaun, and I gotta say it's gonna be the pogo stick kill, because where in any other franchise can you see the main horror slasher kill somebody with a goddamn pogo stick? I mean, even Chucky has never done something like that. My number 3 kill is going to be from Leprechaun 3, and this is where we have Loretto wishing herself to be young and beautiful again, and with that, she wants bigger tits, a bigger ass, and the Leprechaun gives all of that to her to the point where her tits and ass explode. Need I say more? For my number 2 favorite kill, I gotta take it back to Leprechaun Returns again. I know, it just has really good kill scenes. And this one is gonna be saying goodbye to our longtime favorite character, Ozzy, where the Leprechaun bursts out of his chest like an alien. And this kill was done with a lot of gore. It's also, you know, taking away a character that we know and love. And what I really appreciate about it is the callback to the original, with the Leprechaun coming out with the gold coin that he swallowed 25 years earlier. I mean, that's just a piece of continuity you would never imagine them to refer to, and yet there it is. But my number 1 favorite kill in any Leprechaun movie has got to go to my favorite Leprechaun movie, Leprechaun 4 in Space, and it's going to be the ball sack kill. Leprechaun regenerates himself somehow by swimming up a man's piss stream, manifesting himself inside of his body, and for some reason deciding to come out of the man's balls. And his balls grow gigantic and explode and give birth to this miniature menace. And really, I can't think of anything else that is quite as brilliantly cinematic as that moment. So what is the future of this franchise? Will we ever see the Leprechaun again? And will Warwick Davis ever reprise his role? Realistically, it has been 22 years since he has played the character, and putting on all that makeup and the physicality of the role and everything else that's needed and required, once you get older, it's not quite as easy of a task. And he is in his mid-50s now, and as much as we want it, I think that it might be better to temper our expectations. The statement he made about not doing horror because of his kids might just be a little bit of an easy letdown for us. I also don't think that Lyndon Porco was terrible, and I know this is bizarre coming from somebody that has so adamantly defended the fact that Freddy Krueger can only be played by Robert Englund as a character. But I think with the nature of leprechauns as a concept, and that there can be many different interpretations of what that is, it's not so singular as Freddy. And all things being equal, I would rather have Warwick Davis return. But if he refuses, or if he can't do it, I'd say give Lyndon Porco another chance. Leprechaun Returns really isn't that bad. But as far as I can find, sources as recent as September of 2024 mention that Lionsgate has once again began work on rebooting the Leprechaun series, with Felipe Vargas currently set to direct, whose credits right now mostly include all horror short films, but they're decently received. He states, "I'm so honored to be part of that project. It's such a cool franchise. To me, what makes the franchise so special is that it really is limitless. You can do so much with these scares, you can really push the boundaries with these scenes, and it doesn't need to be grounded. It can just be gory, sexy, crazy. I think you can just have fun with it. We're all still figuring out that tone and the balance between horror and comedy. I would love for it to be scary as hell, but also hilarious. I think we're going back to a lot of the roots of the Leprechaun in a lot of different ways, which I'm really excited about. But I think you also want to bring on a new audience, so it's a really tricky one to figure out. So it seems like he at least gets the franchise for what it is and wants to bring it back to what we appreciate so much about it, with giving it a modern spin, and I can appreciate that. Information also points to it being written by Mike Van Ways, whose most recent film credit right now is the screenplay for the live-action Lilo and Stitch, dropping later this year. Hey, both Stitch and Leprechaun are tiny maniacs, so it kind of makes sense. So at least there is some hope for the franchise for anybody that's looking forward to seeing a new Leprechaun. But honestly, for me, it feels like 2018, when Leprechaun Returns came out, isn't really that long ago. Maybe that's also just me getting older and realizing how fast time flies by, but in comparison to some of the other horror franchises out there, it really hasn't been that long since the most recent Leprechaun movie. I'm not sure if Lionsgate is going to push for a theatrical release. If so, that would be the first Leprechaun movie in theaters since 1994's Leprechaun 2. But worst case scenario, after Origins, we really have nothing to lose here. I'll see it whether it comes out in theaters, direct to video, streaming, whatever the case may be. And after I see it, I'm sure I'll come online to talk about it with all of you guys afterwards. Okay, so the time has come for me to give you my ranking of the entire Leprechaun franchise. Now, normally I do a tier list for something like this, but when it comes to this franchise in particular, I think it might be better to just do a general ranking, starting from the bottom and working our way up. So this is my definitive list of the entire Leprechaun franchise. All right, so we got to start at the bottom. Now, many people would say all of these films are at the bottom, but I disagree. There's some good ones in here, but the first one here on the list is not one of those. So I think very bottom, number 8, is of course going to be Leprechaun Origins. I don't think it's any surprise that this is at the very bottom. This one strays the farthest from what the rest of the series is. It attempts to take itself way too seriously, and it turns the Leprechaun, instead of a wisecracking, fun horror character, into just a generic little monster that looks like a creature from The Descent, and it just is not very good. Now, the thing is, I could maybe appreciate this movie if it was actually a decent horror film in its own right. Like, okay, it has nothing to do with how the Leprechaun's ever been presented in this franchise, but maybe if they made a really good horror movie, you know, I could still like it for what it is. But everything about this movie is terrible. The acting is horrendous across the board. There's no tension. There's no intensity. Everything is so dark, you can barely see what's going on. Things are super predictable. The camera's always shaking. It's always switching to these predator POV shots of the Leprechaun that look awful. It's just filmed poorly. And this is coming from a guy that makes these stupid YouTube skits, all right, that are like 10 times worse. But, you know, I don't have the budget they have, all right? So maybe I could make a good Leprechaun movie if I did. All I'm saying is that Leprechaun Origins is terrible. Now, next above that, in the number 7 spot, I'm going to put Leprechaun Back to the Hood. Now, I know that might be surprising here because this is one of the Warwick Davis films, but I do think this is the weakest across the board. I think that the Leprechaun himself has a really cool redesign here. It's not terribly different than what we're used to, but he looks pretty cool. But beyond the design itself, the kills in this movie are overall not that great, along with the characters just feeling like a massive step down from the first In the Hood movie that had a little bit more fun with itself and a little bit more fun with the concept. What humor it does try to have still kind of fails, and the movie just seems like it never ends. Like it just keeps going on, and how they eventually defeat the Leprechaun is so lame. I mean, he has all of these abilities and his only weakness is 4-leaf clovers, and yet somehow he just falls into wet cement and that does it. And that's the last we ever see of Warwick Davis as the Leprechaun, is just drowning in wet cement. I mean, it's just such a sad goodbye to such a long-lasting legacy of a character, and super disappointing movie. Now, up above that in the number 6 spot, I'm going to put Leprechaun Returns from 2018. Like I said, it might be a little bit surprising that I'm putting this movie above a movie with Warwick Davis, but Back to the Hood just really does not do it for me. And the thing about Leprechaun Returns is it kind of surprised me with how much I actually enjoyed it. Now, again, it's not incredible, but it has some fantastic kill scenes, and that's something that a lot of these movies are kind of lacking. There are great kill scenes throughout the Leprechaun franchise, but I feel like Leprechaun Returns really upped the gore and upped the intensity of them to, maybe it was because of being a Sci-Fi Channel movie that they were just able to do things that the others couldn't. For a movie that didn't really need to be a legitimate sequel, since the Leprechaun franchise has never had a sequel, it actually does a pretty good job. The only thing I don't like is them killing off Jennifer Aniston's character, you know, off screen. They could have just mentioned she was somewhere else, but maybe it was a little bit of a dig, you know, to kill her off because she's not going to return anyways. But whatever the case, I thought it actually did a pretty good job connecting it to the original, and Lyndon Porco was not bad as the Leprechaun. He's no Warwick Davis, but he wasn't that bad. All right, in the number 5 spot is going to be Leprechaun 5, Leprechaun in the Hood. So like I said, I think this movie has a lot more fun with the concept. I also like the idea of this group of friends that are trying to make, you know, more positive, upbeat messages in their music, but they're constantly told by the industry that they need to talk about, you know, the more dangerous aspects of the hood because that's what sells, you know, and I liked Ice-T in that role. As well as his flashback in the beginning where he has the giant afro discovering the Leprechaun for the first time. You have Warwick Davis in there just having a blast in this scenario. And, of course, his rap at the end, along with him having a bunch of hoes, because why wouldn't he? You know, it just is enjoyable. Not as enjoyable as the other ones, but it's still pretty good. My number 4 spot is going to be Leprechaun 3, or Leprechaun Goes to Las Vegas. They do a lot of fun things with the concept here. I think this is one of the better ones. My favorite aspect of this movie is having the wish-granting gold coin. I think that was a really cool MacGuffin idea they could have spread throughout the rest of the movies that they never really ended up doing, but I like that it keeps switching hands. I like that different people are all wishing for, of course, very selfish things that blow up in their face and that sort of thing. The only thing that I think it really fails at is the 2 lead characters. They're just kind of boring. I think all the side characters are way more entertaining. The magician, you know, all of those characters are way more fun to watch than the actual lead characters. It also has the weird subplot about him being bitten and turning into a leprechaun, which didn't need to be there. But besides that, pretty good movie. All right, moving into the top 3. At number 3, this might surprise some people, but in my number 3 spot, I'm going to put the original Leprechaun. Yeah, so I do love this movie a lot, but I do think there's two Leprechaun movies that I find to be far more entertaining than this one, but this one did lay the groundwork. It set the template. It was the first exposure to the world of the Leprechaun, whatever that means. Obviously, you have Jennifer Aniston in there in one of her early roles, which is partly why the movie is so famous, but beyond that, there's a lot of fun things happening here. I love the friendship between Ozzy and Alex. I think it adds a good kind of mix of, you know, it's a horror movie, it's rated R, there's lots of violent killings, but there's also this kind of like more fun, whimsical feeling with these characters that believe in superstitions and they follow the end of the rainbow and come across the gold and everything. I just wish the kill count was up a little bit more. I think it's really lacking in kills, but beyond that, the original Leprechaun is a ton of fun and it's definitely worth watching. Now, in my number 2 spot of the Leprechaun franchise, I'm gonna put Leprechaun 2. I actually think Leprechaun 2 is severely underrated. I think it's one of the most entertaining films in this whole franchise with characters that are actually pretty good. They kind of fit the bill as your standard typical 80s slasher characters, but I think that that's kind of why it works. It makes me feel like I'm watching, I don't know, Nightmare on Elm Street 2 or, you know, a sequel to one of these other horror franchises that just sort of have this generic kind of comfortable quality to them. Like, it's like we've seen this movie before, but in a good way. I don't know if that makes any sense to anyone, but I like a lot of things about this movie. I like the kills. I like the old drunk Morty and him trying to always kind of, you know, scam his way to the top. I like the concept of the Leprechaun just wanting to have a bride. It's a little bit more interesting than the typical gotta get my gold back. It's like, well, I need to marry somebody. And as I've said, Leprechaun 2 is the only movie in the whole franchise that actually takes place on St. Patrick's Day, which a lot of people bring these movies out to watch them for St. Patrick's Day. You know, you watch Jason on Friday the 13th, you watch Michael on Halloween. Who do you watch on St. Patrick's Day? Well, it's the Leprechaun, but there's only one Leprechaun movie that is about well, it's not about St. Patrick's Day, but like, you know, the whole scene in the bar where everyone's dressed up, that awkward moment where the little person comes in and offers a man chocolate in the restroom because that happens so often in life. So I don't know, man. All I'm saying is that I think Leprechaun 2 is kind of underappreciated and it's one of my favorites in the whole series. But ultimately at number 1, there is no contest. There is no movie in this series that gives me the joy that Leprechaun 4 in space gives me. Now, a lot of people would put Leprechaun 4 towards the bottom or say that they hate it, but to me, I don't understand why. If you're gonna go batshit crazy, like, okay, I could understand putting Leprechaun 1 or 2 above Leprechaun 4 because it's more traditional. You know, we're dealing with leprechauns and gold and, you know, a more standard idea. You know, the leprechaun in Leprechaun 4 may as well just be a random space monster, right? It's like it doesn't even matter that it's a leprechaun. It's a creature killing you that has magic, okay? But the things that happen in Leprechaun 4 are so fucking hilarious. Like, a weird cyborg German scientist turns into a giant monster spider. The leprechaun births itself from a man's ball sack. It's got lightsabers. It's got space princesses that just take their clothes off for no reason. Got Miguel Nunez Jr., who is amazing, and I love whenever he shows up in a horror movie. It's got a cyborg drag queen military leader using nunchucks. I just don't understand how you don't want that in a movie. No, but I'm not even trying to be funny or contrarian here. I really do think Leprechaun 4 is hilarious. I think it is a wildly entertaining movie and probably one of the best horror character goes to space movies there's ever been. I think if there's a standard, you can make an argument for Jason X, but I think if there's a standard for taking your horror character into space, it's Leprechaun 4. But also, guys, I want to thank you for watching this video. If you've made it this far, a lot of time and turmoil goes into making these vids, and if you enjoyed this or you enjoy the other retrospectives, or if this is your first time here, no matter what it is, whether you've watched from the Halloween one or whether you've watched from all of the videos I made for that, or whether this is your first one, regardless, if somehow you're at this point in the video, I want to say thank you so much for giving me your time and watching me talk about this absurd series, of which I have not seen in a long time, and there's a few movies in here I'd never seen, so, you know, first time watch for me as well. It would mean a lot to me if you gave the video a like or a comment, and if you want to help support the channel on a deeper level, it would really, really mean a lot to me if you decided to sign up for the Patreon or became a channel member. As low as just $1 a month helps me out more than you could possibly know. And if you like the retrospectives, I actually upload every retrospective as I work on the video on Patreon, so you get to see segments of the video months early, you know, if you find that to be an incentive or not. But whether you do or not, or whether you just want to watch the video and like it, I appreciate it so much, man. But before we end this out, I did have something happen to me. Ghostface showed up at my house. I got knocked out. And, well, what happened afterwards isn't something I really want to talk about, so I'll just show you.
Yeah, come on, let me out of here! Let me out of here! I just want to talk about the Leprechaun, man. That's too much to ask.
Do you think anybody really gives a shit about the Leprechaun? It's not the time for that. You've been distracting yourself with this trivial horror bullshit, and now it's time to talk about what the people really want.
Okay, alright, I get it. You want me to review the Scream franchise, right? And I know that that's the last big slasher I have to tackle, but, like, bruh, the fandom, come on.
Oh, boo-hoo. If you can't take online criticism at this point, you shouldn't be doing YouTube in the first place. And besides, weren't you the one that said you didn't want to do any of these stupid skits like other people do? Well, look at you now, you little dwarf. You're tied up to your chair, forced to endure that which you originally chose not to become. Looks like you die a decent YouTuber, or you live long enough to see yourself become the slop.
Okay, fine. I'll do it. I'll review the Scream series, okay? I'm sorry. I wanted to be a little festive, you know, St. Patrick's Day. Nobody talks about St. Patrick's Day. It goes from, like, Valentine's Day to spring to summer, and people forget, man, and I just wanted to bring back the magic and the wonder of the Leprechaun. Even the Leprechaun franchise, only one movie takes place on St. Patrick's Day. I mean, even the Leprechaun series doesn't even care about St. Patrick's Day, so this is what I'm here for, man.
What's funny is that I never said anything about reviewing the Scream franchise. I have something far more interesting.
Wait, what do you mean?
Do you want to know what it is?
Oh.
Do you recognize this? Take it. What is your pleasure, sir?
I can't do it! I won't do it! I refuse! No!